欢迎您收看华尔街电视简报。印度央行行长敦促金融科技公司组建自律机构。路透社，印度储备银行 RBI 行长沙克蒂坎塔达斯呼吁金融科技 FinTech 公司建立一个自律机构来解决他们的需求和挑战。在全球金融科技节上发表讲话时，达斯敦促 FinTech 公司成立一个自律组织 SRO， 使他们能够更频繁地表达自己的需求。SRO 还将有助于减轻 RBI 的监管负担。副行长 T. Robbie Sanker 补充说， SRO 可以促进公司、监管机构和利益相关者之间的合作，同时通过解决市场诚信、行为、数据隐私、网络安全和风险管理等问题，在消费者、投资者和监管机构之间建立信任。英国国民西敏寺银行确认海索恩斯维特将加入担任董事长。路透社，理查德·海索恩斯维特是前万事达卡董事长，已被选为取代霍华德·戴维斯的英国国民西敏银行新董事长。海索恩斯维特将于2024年1月8日加入董事会，并于4月16日接任董事长职务。他的年薪将为 77.5 万英镑，与前任相同。全球监管机构警告称，对于对冲基金的非常高杠杆存在风险。加拿大环球邮报，金融稳定委员会 FSB 警告称，对冲基金部分领域的杠杆率现在非常高，但由于数据缺口较大，很难全面评估非银行机构的脆弱性。FSB 指出，在2020年3月的新冠疫情大流行期间，非银行金融机构出现的许多缺陷仍然存在。FSB 表示，大部分金融杠杆位于其他金融中介机构，如经纪商、对冲基金、金融公司、控股公司和证券化工具。他补充说，一些对冲基金，特别是美国、英国和欧盟的对冲基金，采用复杂的策略，使得很难快速评估或解决脆弱性。FSB 已提出更严格的规定，使开放式基金更具弹性，但面临行业的反对。据政府消息人士透露，将在 G20 领导人峰会上讨论有关加密货币的提案。路透社，国际货币基金组织 IMF 和金融稳定委员会 FSB 已向即将在本周末举行的 G20 领导人峰会提交了有关加密货币的提案。该提案已发送给所有参与国，印度还准备了一份总结该报告的总统备忘录。加快绿色转型也会使其更加廉价。欧洲央行，路透社，一项由欧洲央行 ECB 进行的新研究发现，加快转向更环保的经济对于欧元区的公司、家庭和银行来说比延迟转变更便宜。该研究利用了欧元区290万家公司和600家银行的数据，发现提前实施绿色政策和投资以淘汰化石燃料并节约能源将减少家庭和公司的违约，从而减少银行的损失。在加速转型的情景下，到2025年，欧元区企业将投资2万亿欧元 2.15 万亿美元，而在延迟转型的情景下，投资额将仅为5000亿欧元。尽管最初成本较高，但欧洲央行表示，后期较低的能源开支和金融风险意味着银行贷款的年度损失将在2026年达到130亿欧元的峰值，然后在2030年降至66亿欧元。调查显示，通货膨胀导致更多加拿大大学生在完成学业后选择留在家中。加拿大环球邮报，最近由 RBC 进行的一项调查显示，由于通货膨胀的上升，加拿大越来越多的高等教育学生选择在完成学业时与父母一起生活。调查发现， 47% 的受访者表示他们将在即将到来的学年与父母一起生活，而2013年这一比例为 36%。 此外， 43% 的学生依赖父母的经济支持，这一比例比10年前的 29% 有所增加。调查还显示， 45% 的学生预计将毕业时负债高达2万加元，而2013年这一比例为 30%。 瑞典央行行长弗洛登表示，通胀预计会下降，但仍需要紧缩政策。路透社，瑞典皇冠目前被低估，其疲软使得央行瑞典国家银行难以降低通胀。副行长马丁·弗洛登表示，如果银行找到支持皇冠的工具，将准备使用它们。瑞典国家银行最近对外汇风险进行了对冲，因为它预计皇冠将会走强。然而， 该银行仍然担心通胀可能会远远超过其 2% 的目标，并预计将在9月和可能的11月再次加息。银行将帮助客户在诈骗电话中识别冒充者。英国每日电讯数字银行 Monzo 推出了一项新的应用内功能，允许客户验证自称来自该银行的来电是否真实。此举旨在应对冒充骗局，即诈骗者假冒信任机构的人员，诱使受害者进行付款。数据显示，2022年有45367起冒充骗局案件，总计造成 1.776 亿英镑 2.44 亿美元的损失。Monzo 的新功能使客户在接到电话时可以在应用上检查 Monzo 状态，如果状态显示他们并非与银行的人通话，则建议他们挂断电话并报告此事。非洲领导人呼吁实施新的全球税收来资助应对气候变化的行动。路透社在非洲气候峰会之后的一份声明中，非洲领导人呼吁对化石燃料贸易、海上运输和航空业征收全球碳税。内罗毕宣言还要求主要污染国和国际金融机构投入更多资源用于气候融资，并倡导改革多边金融体系。该宣言将成为非洲在11月份 COP28 峰会上的谈判立场基础。非洲目前只获得每年3000亿美元气候变化影响应对所需资金的 12%。早间更新，福特承诺全面审查绿地土地交换。加拿大环球邮报，安大略省省长道格·福特 Doug Ford 宣布对该省的绿化带进行审查。此前他的政府决定开放土地用于住房开发。该审查将重新评估去年从绿化带中移除的15块土地中的14块，并将考虑市政当局和开发商提出的多达800项请求，要求从80万公顷的环境保护区中移除更多块土地。批评者要求将所有土地归还绿化带，他们的呼吁得到了安大略省审计长和廉政专员报告的支持。该报告得出结论，政府的土地选择过程存在缺陷，有利于某些开发商。早盘报价，油价受挫后市场不安。路透社，全球市场在周三面临困境，因为他们评估了一个复杂的通缩局面，这使得峰值利率的前景变得复杂。沙特阿拉伯和俄罗斯决定将自愿减少石油供应延长到年底，这使得国际原油价格首次超过每桶90美元，抹去了今年以来帮助拉低总体通胀率的负面年度基数效应。这意味着央行可能需要更加努力地实现其通胀目标，总体通胀率可能在本月再次上升。印度能否团结分裂的 G20 来应对气候融资问题？南华早报分析师表示，即将在印度举行的 G20 领导人峰会可能对气候资金和贫困国家债务减免具有重要意义。G20 的主要争议点是气候融资和向中低收入国家提供资金。许多这些国家正在与由疫情和气候变化影响加剧的债务问题做斗争，并面临着实现净零目标的艰难过渡。G20 需要向发展中国家提供负担得起的融资，并避免让他们承担过多的承诺来实现净零目标。此外，负债累累的国家将更大比例的债务归还给多边开发银行和私人债权人，因此 G20 暂停债务偿还的决定仅适用于双边官方援助。如果 G20 同意为多边开发银行注资，他们可以为负债紧张的国家免除债务。G20 峰会上的讨论还预计将集中在向发展中国家提供更多贷款援助、改革国际债务架构、协调加密货币的监管，以及解决地缘政治不确定性对粮食和能源安全的影响等问题上。通报发现，通货膨胀和高利率影响加拿大人的心理健康。加拿大环球邮报根据加拿大心理健康研究协会的一项调查，超过一半的加拿大人由于通货膨胀和利率上升带来的经济困境而面临心理健康问题。调查发现，51%的加拿大人表示通货膨胀对他们的心理健康产生了负面影响，而24%的人表示由于通货膨胀而陷入了债务。该研究还发现，23%的加拿大人担心自己支付租金或抵押贷款的能力，而37%的人在养活自己或家人方面遇到了困难。期货下跌，投资者等待更多经济数据以评估美联储的利率路径。路透社，随着投资者等待关键数据的发布，包括美联储关于美国经济状况的报告， 华尔街期货下跌，以寻找关于央行利率走势的线索。周二，国债收益率和油价上涨导致股市下跌，因为粘性通胀迹象引发了投资者对美联储货币政策轨迹的担忧。投资者关注美联储的褐皮书，以了解美国经济的快照。此前还有下周预定的备受期待的通胀数据和美联储的政策决定。谢谢您的收看。上面播报的内容是六度团队推荐的全球专业媒体、智库、政府机构和行业专家的最新报道、分析简报。更详细的内容，请大家去这些媒体、智库的网站阅读。这些内容并不一定反映六度简报的立场，亦不能作为任何决策的建议。六度团队由专业媒体人、学者、科学家组成的独立新型媒体，大家可以根据自己的专业要求订阅各种简报，网址是6dobrief.com。您在世界任何地方都可以通过电邮收到六度简报。欢迎您收看华尔街评论。瞧瞧共和党的言论自由胆量。纽约时报评论版。众议院司法委员会的一份临时工作报告指责拜登政府侵犯了选举否认者的第一修正案权利。报告声称，政府与大型科技公司和虚假信息合作伙伴勾结，对声称唐纳德·特朗普赢得2020年选举的人进行审查。报告认为，将言论标记为错误信息或虚假信息并不剥夺其第一修正案的保护。报告建议，联邦政府禁止对美国人的政治言论进行审查。考虑到共和党一直在领导封锁有关种族分裂概念的教学，试图驱逐田纳西州议会的2名民主党成员因在一起校园枪击事件后呼吁控制枪支而受到威胁要弹劾北卡罗来纳州的一名自由派法官因公开谈论种族偏见，并在全国范围内协助禁书运动。这份报告和对选举否认审查的指责尤为讽刺。实质上，共和党已成为审查的主要推动力量，以此来压制反对声音，同时声称他们自己的第一修正案权利受到民主党的威胁。共和党封锁意识形态对手的努力在于他们试图规范公立学校和大学的教学内容。自2021年1月以来，已有14个州通过法律禁止在学校教授批判性种族理论，其中许多新法律提议扣留不遵守规定的学区的资金，并允许家长起诉向学生提供被禁材料的教育工作者。阿拉巴马州真是其违抗联邦法院的历史。纽约时报评论版。阿拉巴马州因无视创建第2个黑人多数选区的命令而受到联邦法官的批评。法官指责阿拉巴马州立法机构甚至没有试图遵守这一要求。州检察长办公室在一份声明中表示，计划向最高法院上诉该决定。最高法院已经告诉该州，他通过削弱黑人选民的权利违反了1965年的选举权法案。尽管如此，立法机构拒绝创建第2个黑人多数选区。法官将指定一位特别专员在明年选举前创建第2个选区。阿拉巴马州对法院的蔑视表明了美国某些地区对法律、平等代表和公平的蔑视。该州的共和党立法者希望法院被视为第2个选区的创造者，而不是他们自己。一个进步的詹姆斯·邦德是美国文化帝国主义的证明。纽约时报评论版。詹姆斯·邦德最新的对手是伊恩·弗莱明遗产出版的一本新小说中的右翼民粹主义者。这本名为《在陛下的特工服务中》的小说中，邦德保护查尔斯3世国王免受名为维塞克斯的阿瑟斯坦的恶棍的侵害，后者被描绘为一个小英格兰主义者和脱欧派。这本小说旨在激怒保守派，它的存在表明了美国进步主义如何影响了英语世界。虽然美国保守派羡慕他们的英语世界的同行，但加拿大和英国的保守派却感到文化上受到围困。他们对进步力量的崛起和美式觉醒在他们的国家中的普遍存在感到悲叹。特别是英国的保守党人认为，保守派的统治对政府和文化中的进步偏见的推进毫无作为。两国的保守派也对不断增长的移民率和进步言论规范的执行感到沮丧。他们还认为，他们的国家精英正在寻找自己版本的2020年美国的种族清算。像加拿大和英国这样的小国家和小精英阶层更容易实施意识形态的一致性，导致进步思想更加普遍。你将会听到的4个反对药品价格谈判的观点。纽约时报评论版。 拜登总统最近宣布了将与医疗保险进行价格谈判的首批10种药物，这些药物包括治疗糖尿病、心脏病、血液癌症、血栓和类风湿性关节炎的药物，这些疾病影响着数百万美国人。尽管范围比倡导者最初希望的要小，但通胀减缓法案 IRA 的通过是民主党在大型制药公司面前的重大政治胜利。对创新的影响可能会被削弱的一个重要原因是，药物在很长一段时间内都不受政府谈判的影响。对于小分子药物如药丸，直到 FDA 批准后的9年，对于注射生物制品为13年。其他富裕国家存在的医疗保健价格控制是这些国家人均花费不到美国的1半的重要原因。然而，价格控制是有争议的，在当前时代可以被描绘成大政府。相反， IRA 启动了联邦政府与制药公司之间的谈判过程，仅确定医疗保险将为一部分药物支付的费用。保罗·克鲁格曼给中国的经济建议，稍微放松一下。纽约时报评论版：中国面临着一系列经济挑战，包括不景气的房地产行业、年轻劳动者高失业率和过高的储蓄水平。然而，中国政府不愿鼓励消费可能会加剧这些问题。保罗·克鲁格曼认为，政府需要采取行动刺激经济并解决这些问题。你不应该独自照顾年迈的父母。纽约时报评论版：美国在应对人口老龄化带来的日益增长的照料需求方面准备不足。目前，约有4200万美国人为50岁或以上的人提供非正式的支持，其中许多人在经济和心理压力下苦苦挣扎。大多数美国老年人依赖无偿的家庭成员或朋友提供照料，但这些照料者经常面临严重的经济困境和健康问题。此外，照料劳动力市场面临高员工流动率和人员短缺问题，工资低，工作条件艰苦。美国的医疗保健系统正在将医疗程序从医院转移到家庭环境中，这意味着家庭成员越来越需要提供复杂的照料。目前的联邦老年人计划，如医疗保险和医疗补助，无法承担在家长期护理的费用。为了解决这些问题，国会需要通过立法为各州提供建立更好的支付标准和培训机会的财政激励措施，以及支持劳动力的创新计划。联邦政府还应增加用于家庭和社区护理的医疗补助资金，并为家庭照料者提供税收抵免和其他福利。各州还应采取行动，建立公共长期护理保险计划、带薪家庭和病假制度以及灵活的病假政策。家庭照料者需要更好的培训和教育，以及在应对复杂的医疗保健系统和处理其工作的心理方面的支持。在一个老龄化的社会中，照料工作是至关重要的，关键是照料者能够得到他们所需的支持。欧洲面临比美国更艰难的通胀斗争。路透观点：尽管努力避免衰退和失业，但欧元区面临着衰退的风险。经济活动疲软、信贷紧缺和借贷成本上升都指向潜在的衰退。然而，该地区的劳动者可能会幸免于难，因为失业率创历史新低，仅为 6.4%。强大的劳动法规和工会可以限制大规模失业，即使在衰退的情况下也是如此。然而，劳动力成本上升对欧洲央行将通胀降至 2% 的目标构成了挑战。俄罗斯人越来越好了。外交事务：乌克兰对俄罗斯的反攻行动进展缓慢且具有挑战性。乌克兰军队在协调联合军事行动和有效利用火炮、步兵和空中力量方面遇到了困难。美国和北约提供的训练也受到质疑，因为它可能不适合乌克兰正在进行的战争类型。此外，乌克兰的西方盟友在提供武器和装备方面行动迟缓，使得俄罗斯得以巩固其阵地。乌克兰的军事组织和教义受到苏联军队的影响，也带来了挑战。俄罗斯的行为变化也加剧了乌克兰军队面临的挑战。俄罗斯武装部队改进了战场战术，学会了更有效地瞄准乌克兰部队和武器，并保护自己的指挥系统。俄罗斯还恢复了其电子战能力，削弱了乌克兰的通信和情报收集能力。俄罗斯军队重建了其指挥和控制基础设施和流程，进行了改变，以更好地保护其指挥所并改善通信。俄罗斯军队还调整了其步兵战术，并将火炮整合到专门的旅中，使其能够更好地保卫阵地并集中火力。 尽管有这些改进，俄罗斯军队仍然在一些方面表现不佳。俄罗斯武装部队在整合指挥和控制方面存在困难，政治和军事领导之间缺乏信任。这些结构性缺陷阻碍了信息共享，阻碍了主动性，并阻止了战场上的经验教训对战略和教义的影响。乌克兰的反攻并没有失败，但进展缓慢，需要耐心。北约成员国必须继续为乌克兰提供长期的武器和军事支持。云南的最后一座尖塔。外交事务。中国领导人习近平的中国化运动旨在推广汉族文化和历史，却使回族穆斯林等少数民族宗教群体边缘化。中国政府一直在拆除清真寺，并从这些宗教建筑中移除传统的阿拉伯风格特征，如圆顶和尖塔。这种推动中国化的努力是习近平更广泛努力的一部分，即将中国的现代身份与古代汉族身份联系起来，并消除国内外的外来影响。国家对回族穆斯林和其他少数民族群体的压迫不仅威胁到文化多样性，还可能危及中国的软实力和国际声誉，特别是在穆斯林世界。它还可能导致中国和南亚、东南亚邻国的穆斯林人口之间的文化脱钩。中国共产党对宗教和少数民族的态度在历史上有所不同。例如，在明朝时期，穆斯林被迫采用中国语言和文化，并与非穆斯林结婚。在20世纪60年代和70年代的文化大革命期间，中国穆斯林成为红卫兵的目标，许多伊玛目被监禁，清真寺被改建为其他用途。然而，在改革派领导人邓小平的领导下，对伊斯兰教采取了更为和解的态度，修复了被毁的清真寺，并建造了新的清真寺。习近平政府代表了对这种宽容立场的背离，回归到更加民族主义和以汉族为中心的中国身份的愿景。永远不要对亚洲北约说不。外交政策。拜登政府与美国在印太地区的盟友和伙伴建立联盟的努力正在加强，这包括提升美日澳印四方对话，签署澳英美协定 AUKUS， 以及邀请澳大利亚、日本、新西兰和韩国领导人参加北约峰会。尽管官员们否认了建立亚洲北约的说法，但由于该地区地缘政治动态的变化，这样一个集团的可能性变得更加可行。二战后，美国在太平洋地区建立了一系列双边联盟，形成了轴心与辐射模式，但并未创建一个集体安全组织。然而，该地区的动态变化，包括美国在海上领域军事力量的减弱，以及来自中国和朝鲜的军事威胁的增加，使得在亚洲建立更大范围的集体安全的逻辑更加令人信服。然而，反对亚洲北约的论点也变得更加有说服力，包括与中国的经济关系以及可能疏远东南亚和太平洋地区的重要国家。最终，建立亚洲北约将取决于中国国家主席习近平以及在该地区集体安全的需求是否超过其他关切。新加坡的财富繁荣进入最敏感的阶段。路透观点。最近在新加坡发生的洗钱丑闻，以及中国遏制资本外逃的努力，导致资金流入这个亚洲中心放缓。新加坡银行和官员很可能会在与富裕客户的交易中变得更加谨慎，导致加强审查和小心的外交立场。这可能有助于减少脏钱流入该国的风险，但也对当地财富管理行业的风险管理改进提出了疑问。此外，新加坡还需要解决一个问题，即避免让人们认为它正在利用中国的困境，同时努力吸引富裕的中国家庭来到这个城市。对英国在肯尼亚的免责挑战。外交政策。肯尼亚的一个议会委员会已经启动了对英国军队在肯尼亚训练部队 BTOC 滥用行为的调查。BTOC 被指控谋杀、对妇女进行性虐待，并在肯尼亚北部的南游击基地附近使用危险化学品。英国驻肯尼亚高级专员尼尔·威根将与调查合作。英国政府重申，调查属于肯尼亚警察局的管辖范围，并补充说进一步评论将是不适当的。烟花的回归为香港所有人的生活增添了光彩。南华早报评论版。香港计划通过一系列举措重振夜生活并推动经济发展，其中包括10月1日恢复国庆烟花。由于社会动荡和疫情，自2019年以来一直取消了烟花表演。政府计划通过引入夜市、音乐表演、艺术展览和街头美食来激活夜生活场景。 购物中心也将延长营业时间，并提供优惠和折扣。目标是使香港成为一个有竞争力的旅游目的地，吸引更多游客，同时提供真实的本地体验。谢谢您的收看。上面播报的内容是六度团队推荐的全球专业媒体、智库、政府机构和行业专家的最新报道、分析简报。更详细的内容，请大家去这些媒体、智库的网站阅读。这些内容并不一定反映六度简报的立场，亦不能作为任何决策的建议。六度团队由专业媒体人、学者、科学家组成的独立新型媒体，大家可以根据自己的专业要求订阅各种简报，网址是6dobrief.com。您在世界任何地方都可以通过电邮收到六度简报。
We talk about this all the time. We've had people who run the CHIPS program and the IRA, et cetera. But big picture, what is your concern about some of the domestic policy choices being made right now?
Thank you for referring to my article. And it is a concern that not just the government's getting involved in industrial policy in the U.S. The U.S., as you've talked about previously, I've heard some episodes. At various times in its history, there's been public investment by the U.S. in technology. There's been more aggressive, less aggressive efforts. What I'm worried about are essentially four big things. First, so much of this has been cloaked as rescuing the industrial sector and not so subtly buying the votes of angry white industrial workers who feel left behind in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and West Virginia. And I understand that's a need. I'm not sure it's going to work. I'd like to think there's other ways to win an election. But the good news on that is several of the people who advocate this policy have now admitted, even if it goes well, we're talking affecting a few towns, several 100,000 people, which matters but isn't going to make a thing. The second thing, which I'm much more concerned about, is whenever you create a government program that's about giving money to individual companies and you combine it with this trade policy that's very much, as the president keeps saying, American made, American built, American exports.
Buy America.
Buy America. That you end up with creating what we used to complain about a lot in Japan and Korea and China and Europe, these national champions. So, it may be that Intel or Micron, just to pick two of the names that are out there, are great companies with great tech, but you put them on the government payroll for billions of dollars and you say that we want to make sure there's an American presence in this industry, American leadership in this industry, and they can end up taking you to town. And frankly, if Trump gets back in, the corruption opportunities are horrible. Third thing is internationally. I'm hopeful that the Biden administration is realizing that they went a little too far in their anti-trade rhetoric. We can debate how much trade has been fair or unfair and how much that matters. But in the context of what you said in the lead-in, and again, I know you've spoken about this with other people, the U.S. has been basically withdrawing from globalization for 20 plus years. Everyone thinks, globalization did us in, but we've actually, since NAFTA, we've done almost no trade deals. We've cut way back on immigration. We take a lower amount of investment from abroad than we used to. And there's all kinds of blowback from this. There's foreign policy blowback. There's development blowback in the South, the global South. There's technology races. And so this ends up with these things like these subsidies races that we're having with Europe and de facto with China now. The final point, sorry to go on so long, but the biggest thing is where I think the Biden administration is right, is the U.S. had to do something constructive on climate. I mean, it's an emergency. We weren't doing anything. Or at least the government wasn't. And so they were trying to figure out a way. They couldn't do a carbon tax. They couldn't do a lot of things. This package of investments, as they call it, was supposed to get us some climate progress, and it is. My worry is that it's going to end up being a repeat of what happened with COVID vaccines, which is the developing world and even the relatively high-income developing world, places like Brazil or Turkey, are not going to get the access to this technology, or when we have good green technology, it's going to become a political football. Are you loyal to China? Are you loyal to the U.S.? And for saving the planet, to put it bluntly, the most important thing is when we get good new green tech, it gets used and adopted as widely as possible. and this is where I've been particularly trying to engage with the Biden administration to the extent they have interest, is to say, if you're doing this whole bundle of industrial policy and trade policy and nationalist policy, how do we make sure that the technology does get down, that it's not like with COVID vaccines, that you hoard it all for yourself and you make it a political loyalty test? Do you buy from us or do you buy from them?
So many different directions we could go in already, and we're sort of talking about multiple different policies at once. So let me step back and ask a big picture question, which is there a good model of industrial policy in your mind? Can you sort of distinguish between bad industrial policy that potentially leads to protectionist outcomes and perverse incentives and, good industrial policy that does achieve the outcomes that are intended?
It's a very good question, Tracy. And I think the devil's not in the details, but the devil is in some basic design choices. So one aspect is, I think it's much better to have the public investment going more into infrastructure, more into public goods. And some people associated with the Biden administration say, well, that's that old neoliberal thing that didn't work. But actually, those parts did. We just didn't spend enough. So invest in universities, invest in R&D tax credits, invest in skilled immigration, invest in infrastructure of power grid and fiber and EV charging stations, if that's how you want to go. The second thing is, and to be fair, the Biden administration and the Congress have done a little bit on this, is to make it so that even if you're trying to get production at home for, say, a good reason, like we need to have some semiconductor capacity in the U.S., manufacturing capacity in the U.S., you still leave it open that there's room for competition from abroad. So you're trying to avoid the whole corruption and international backlash, or at least reduce those aspects by saying, okay, if it turns out it's a German or a Korean or a Japanese company that has the good tech, we're not going to prevent or discourage our people from buying it or discourage them from selling it here. And again, there are some loopholes, like this whole leasing deal they made for electric vehicles in the bill that they can make. There's more things they can do. But so anyway, to me, those two things, that a lot more of the public investment goes to general good and rather than specific company capacity, and that you make sure that there is competition, including international competition, for the industrial policy goals you have.
I want to go back to something you said, and I think there was a little bit of controversy when you may have said this in another context, but the idea of manufacturing, the politics of manufacturing, maybe the nostalgia for manufacturing this side, and you mentioned, that there are the China shock really hurt certain areas of the Midwest. Is the point of accelerating domestic manufacturing to maybe placate, several 100,000 white men in the Midwest by reinvigorating that? But there is another school of thought, and that I find interesting, which is that actually manufacturing is really important. Complexity is important. Ability to produce advanced goods is an important aspect of being a rich country. Is that false? Do we just have this sort of false nostalgia for the benefits of having a manufacturing economy?
I think both issues you raised, Joe, are right. And just to be clear, white males have just as much right to government largesse as any other group in society. And anything I've said to indicate otherwise was mistaken. I mean, but it is this idea that nostalgia is the word I used. Thank you. That Trump had a lot of this, but I think Biden has some of it. That, there was this sort of golden era when a person without a high school diploma could make a really good living in a plant, and that plant would employ lots of people in one place, and they could depend on the job, and so on. And this created a community and all this. Yeah. And the point of calling it nostalgia is and meaning that's a bad thing, is threefold. First, that really only applied to a small number of people. I mean, even at its height, manufacturing share of employment in the U.S., I don't think ever got much above 30%, and that was in the immediate aftermath of World War II. And obviously there were people, women, people of color, who didn't have equal opportunity in that space as other people. But anyway, so it's still a lot of people. And even now it's 13% of employment. It's still a lot of people. But just to say it was never, ever, ever going to be the engine for everybody. Mm-hmm. The second thing is to say that there is a bias in that underplays just how adaptable a lot of Americans, white, black, female, male, everybody has been, moving around the country. Immigrants who come here, but people who moved in the great migrations from the South to the North for manufacturing, and then out of the North back into the South and to the West. But also communities that came back up. We think about, Charlotte, North Carolina is a financial center. Durham is a technology center. There's this whole area in North Carolina that, several decades ago was tobacco. And Pittsburgh, everybody always cites it because it's amazing. Pittsburgh is now a health center and many other things, and it's not steel anymore. And so there is this sort of bias towards not understanding that change is part of economic life, and it's actually good. But the third thing, which is where I guess it gets a little more controversial, is for some people, and I think this was much more true of Trump and some of the people who supported him, there's this sort of idea that macho tasks of large, hot metal or big, heavy things you can drop on your foot is just somehow more worthy.
The allure of welding.
Yeah, well, and Tracy, as people point out, it's you don't make fun of people for that. That's fine. So for some people, that's a real calling and they really want to do it. But the idea that every son of a welder or daughter of a welder wants to be a welder and should want to be a welder and doesn't want to maybe go into a white collar job or maybe work indoors or outdoors or whatever is just weird. And so, sorry, Joe, your big point, which is the more important one, is can we survive if we don't have a vital manufacturing sector?
Or at least advanced manufacturing.
Right. And I think the answer to that is, well, we do. We just don't have as much manufacturing employment as we used to. So if you look at the very basic numbers, the share of the U.S. economy in value added in manufacturing is basically unchanged or even slightly higher than it was when the manufacturing employment share was much more, which is another way of saying productivity in manufacturing has gone up enormously. We're producing more value stuff at the higher end with fewer people. And so in a sense, we can debate that question you raise, but it's just not even a realistic question. So look at the semiconductors. Yes, it's true. We did not take into account, and I say we, I mean everybody, did not take into account just how dependent certain kinds of semiconductors were on this obviously exposed, very specific set of plants in Taiwan and related. But the fact is, there's a huge number of components of semiconductors, including the ones made by TSMC and the ones made by Samsung and Hynix and others, that are dependent on American technology. They're dependent on American design technology. They're dependent on American intellectual property. They're dependent on American components. And it's the low-end stuff the U.S. doesn't make anymore.
If you take some of these stated goals of this new industrial policy at face value, it feels like a lot of it was sparked by things that happened during the global pandemic when it did become somewhat difficult to get critical components from the East to the West. How do you address that supply chain resiliency concern?
Yeah, I think there's no question, Tracy, that from some sort of optimal planning perspective, or if you meaning, if the government tries to take the interests of the whole society or economy rather than an individual company or investor, we were past the point of resilience. We had too few nodes. But it's important to recognize that didn't happen because of somebody making a stupid decision. That didn't happen because of some perverse government incentives. That happened organically. I mean, you would have things where multinational company, the CFO on an earnings call or whatever would say, and we're going to cut costs 15% next year. And somebody working in a plant 4 levels down says, oh my God, I got a memo, I got to cut costs 20%. And they figure out, oh, if I order this from Korea or this from Mexico, I can get it cheaper. And over time that works. And you realize, oh, there's a whole group of companies down there in Mexico. Maybe I can do some more from them. And it just developed organically. And during COVID, we at the Peterson Institute tried to look more into this, and we discovered it really was that way. That I'm not going to name them, but we would talk to major global manufacturing companies and say, we just want to do research. We just want to understand what your supply chain is. And the response we kept getting was, we don't really know. It just sort of grew up, and we're just now figuring out where it all is. So anyway, that doesn't mean it's still valid for, I don't want to do a double negative. It's still valid for the government to say, in certain critical industries, the interests of the society, the economy are not being taken into account by all these decentralized decisions. But it's worth remembering that even if that's right, by creating resilience, what you're essentially doing is you're saying, I'm taking out a costly insurance policy. I'm building redundant capacity. I'm buying something that's more geopolitically safe, but more expensive. Because remember, there was a price reason why it was done the way it was done. There was a reason stuff was being produced in China, not Mexico. So it may be worth it. And this is the thing I tried to argue in the past. I mean, it may be worth it to do that from a societal perspective, but we shouldn't pretend that it's going to be short-term beneficial for productivity or profits, because what you're doing is you're buying insurance. You're spending money against a bad outcome. The other point, just echoing something we were talking about a minute ago, is the international side.
Right.
As an economist, and when you talk about resilience, the issue is diversification. It's not necessarily reshoring domestic. I mean, it gets a little confused because if you decide China's a strategic rival or worse, then maybe you don't want China, or you may want to distinguish friends for friendshoring. But ultimately, what you care about is diversification. And so if you have one plant in the US and it's hit by a local flood, or it's taken over by a terrorist group within the US, or it's corrupt the same way a corrupt company appears in a different country and it produces substandard products, and you haven't diversified from that, you're still in trouble. So these are the cautions I would put in.
So I'm glad you brought up China, because this leads nicely into the other thing I wanted to ask you. But how much of the current industrial policy do you see as a direct response to a potential either economic or geopolitical threat from China?
One thing that's true of big economic policy decisions in Washington, anywhere, just as it's true of committee decisions in central banks, is your goal is to get the majority of people to say yes. They can each say yes for a completely different reason. You don't need to have a coherent one set of reasons why you say yes. You just want all the people to say yes.
Right. And
so we had, in a sense, the perfect storm behind this set of policies. So there were people with legitimate concerns about China, and particularly from the point of view of supply chain resilience, but also national security. There are people with overhyped, crazy concerns about China, fearing Chinese students, I think, to an excessive degree, for example. There are people who were very concerned about resilience coming out of COVID in the way you said. There are people who were very concerned about these left behind post-industrial communities. There were people who were, you go down the list. There were so many reasons for this policy. And so, so for someone like me to be arguing against it is in some way sort of silly because it's overdetermined, right? There's 1,000 reasons why they're doing this. When we talk about China specifically, I have a new article out in Foreign Affairs, and I argue we should be thinking, to put a bumper sticker on it, more in terms of suction than sanctions. That Xi and the Communist Party have messed up their economy by being interventionist in people's faces, not just politically, in a way they hadn't been for decades. Obviously the Communist Party, the leaders ruled China, but there was what I called a no politics, no problem deal that you see in a lot of autocratic societies.
Deng Xiaoping and idiot sunflower seeds.
Exactly. I was just rereading that.
Perfect. The reference.
In the bio, I was just rereading that part of the bio of Deng that Ezra Vogel did a few years ago. And so you see this in a lot of countries. This was true even under Putin in his early days in Russia. Basically, you don't protest in the streets. You don't run for office against me. You do the occasional bribe. I'll leave you alone to pursue your livelihood, to run your small business. But now zero COVID comes along and everybody has to study Xi thought and all these other things. And the average Chinese person is spooked. Anyway, the upshot of this is I think we need to worry less about containing China in the economic sphere, except for some very specific national security technologies. You can make a case. I think it's more that let Xi put up barriers, put up interventions in his society, let us and the other allies attract capital and people and investment out of China. This worked against the Soviet Union. This worked against the fascists in the 30s. I'm not saying there's going to be wholesale exodus of millions of people, but you want that positive sort of suction pressure on Xi and the regime. And then what usually happens is, as we saw in the Soviet case and as we saw in various other places, the leader in Latin America, the leader puts up more and more restrictions because he gets worried about the money and the people leaving, and he worries about the attractiveness of the alternative. And the more he and his party put up restrictions, the more the people want to leave. And I think that's the kind of dynamic we should be leaning into, if I can use that phrase.
We are definitely going to have to do a history episode just about the story of the idiot sunflower seed company and what that says about the history of the Chinese economic model. But I want to continue along this line because, I think, I don't know, maybe like 15 years ago or pre-great financial crisis, when people talked about Chinese trade, like it was very much focused on like, what is the level of the UN right now? Are they holding it too low and are they boosting? You don't really hear as much about that. Now the story is much more, well, they're really doing a great job investing in domestic battery makers and domestic car makers. And they have this airline, aviation company, Comac, that's might eat into Boeing and Airbus. And it's much less concerned about pure, like, they're competing us because they're too cheap, and more like, actually, they're really getting good at certain high-tech things. Is there concern that's legitimate, like maybe less about the currency level, but is there concern that we should have about, look, they're investing in their domestic champions, maybe we need to respond to them?
I think you've described accurately the way things have developed, Joe. Colleagues of mine at the Peterson Institute, Fred Bergsten, Joe Gagnon, Morris Goldstein, Nick Lardy, 10, 15 years ago were really out there screaming with good reason, with good arguments, about the Chinese government's undervaluation of the yuan. And a lot of the talk about the China shock and some of this political backlash, frankly, would have been muted if the U.S. government, both Democratic and Republican, had listened to us and others and done something about the yuan undervaluation. But to be fair, the Chinese government leadership, basically around the time of the financial crisis, 2008-9, stopped undervaluing the yuan. They at least stopped intervening actively to push down the yuan very much. So that is, in a sense, it mattered, but it was competing on cheap is different than competing on quality. You're absolutely right. And so now the issue is competing on quality. And there, I think it's less about fair, unfair than what are the risks. Okay. Throughout history, business history, modern business history, including competition within the U.S., intellectual property theft, reverse engineering, getting around people's trademarks has always been a factor. And the Chinese corporate sector certainly was worse on this in some ways, but I think you put your finger on it, that it's more a question of investment. Now, we in the U.S. have been the envy of the world in commercial terms for decades because our investment system, for all our problems, for all what happened in 2008 and the run-up to 2008, we do a better job of financing tech than anybody else does. And the Chinese have leapfrogged over the Japanese and the Europeans to become our closest rivals in doing this. But we've also seen huge disaster for them, which they've admitted to in their semiconductor industry. They spent billions, in U.S. terms, billions, trying to develop this high-end semiconductor industry for the last several years, even before the most recent conflict. And they had ended up admitting it didn't pay off at all. And they jailed a bunch of people for corruption. And we don't know how much what was actual corruption versus just punishing poor performance. So just because they throw money at stuff doesn't mean they're there. So long-winded answer to say, You're right, they've shifted from competing cheap on trying to devalue their currency to competing strategically in some industries. I still think our allocation of capital is better and higher return than theirs, but there are definitely things we should be doing to invest, going back to some things Tracy and I were saying a minute ago, invest in training, invest in skilled workers, invest in infrastructure, invest in protection of intellectual property, invest in standards that can help us get ahead.
To what extent is the U.S. now driving deglobalization versus responding to it? Because we're talking a lot about China, but of course China isn't the only country out there that is trying to boost domestic manufacturing or invest more money in strategically important industries.
It's a very troubling question, Tracy, and it's the right one, and it's what I and my colleagues have spent a lot of our last few years working on, because roughly midway through Obama's second term, the consensus in Congress and in a lot of business as well as the unions already was U.S. had been played for a sucker in international economics and globalization. I think this is just fundamentally false. As I mentioned, the U.S. has actually been withdrawing from globalization rather than grappling with it for many years, arguably 20 or 25 years. And whether or not the U.S. has been withdrawing, the existence of China, and even if they behaved well, the existence of 1.4 billion people who are capable of participating in the world economy matters. It's not going to disappear, and they have a right to make a living, even if their leadership doesn't have a right to do everything they do. So the danger, which we've seen come true over the last few years, particularly under Trump, but somewhat continued under Biden, is to scapegoat foreigners, scapegoat China, not even clear for what, given how well the U.S. economy's been doing in a lot of ways, but to just create this sense of we were cheated, we were played for a sucker, we should be the bully. To some degree, that's what Trump and Lighthizer and others have said. And I worried that some of the things the Biden administration said and did in the first couple of years, particularly things Ambassador Tai, the U.S. Trade Representative, has done on the trade front, is like that. It echoes, they independently, Tai and others believe this, but, neoliberal trade liberalization destroyed our economy. Again, it's not clear the economy's been destroyed. Some people have suffered, but that happens all the time, and that has to do with the fact that in our society, we have a very miserly welfare state. And if our society would give a better welfare state, fewer people would suffer. But anyway, I am hoping that between some feeling for reality and the foreign policy realities as well as the economic realities, and just some willingness to be open to basic fairness and evidence, the Biden administration is going to stop going this direction. I don't expect them to tomorrow lift the tariffs and suddenly become free traders. We saw this in Secretary Yellen's speech a couple months ago, and to a lesser degree, somewhat grudgingly, but still there, in Jake Sullivan's speech. Their two big economic speeches, which I know you've discussed.
What are you worried about? And by that, I mean, right now, you could, every day, there's a new factory opening. It looks pretty amazing. There's a new battery factory, and there's a lot of investment. And you look at some of these charts, the lines are going up. Inflation is moderated. We're just talking short-term things, but what worries you? What's the way this goes bad? Or what are the scenarios in which, we had, all this investment does not yield what people hope, and what does that look like to you?
Well, I think first point is, again, I'm hopeful people are realizing this, but it's not going to create that many jobs. I mean, in the end, we only have a finite number of skilled people for constructing these plants and working in these plants. And unless you get a lot of other policies and a lot of other things going on, you're just going to end up moving some of those people from one job to another. So that's the first disappointment. Is that the end of the world? No. Second, as I've tried to say, and building on what you and Tracy were just talking about, is I think the international repercussions become real. I think if the Biden administration doesn't say, okay, we've gone far enough in this direction, or the Trump people come back in and go further in this direction, you start getting retaliation. So we're already in a bad situation where there's this subsidies competition between US and Europe and China, and then to some degree some other countries are going to try to play, but they can't compete. And so it ends up like a really bad version of Boeing Airbus, right? So yeah, it's good to have two companies producing planes. It's also not good that they both get enormous amounts of government subsidies, in part because the other company gets good enormous amounts. It'd be better if we basically did arms control and took it down and equal amounts of reducing the subsidies on both sides and made a deal to keep that from going. And that starts being real big numbers. I mean, that starts being in the tens and hundreds of billions. I mean, that's real money that could be used for other things. Third thing, mentioning what you were saying, since we're at Jackson Hole, is the inflation risk. Yeah. So Chair Powell, in his speech, was perceived as slightly hawkish, more hawkish than expected. I think he was about where I expected him to be, but a tiny bit less hawkish than he should have been. That, given where our labor markets are, which is wonderful, there is still a risk that we could see a resumption of inflation, an acceleration of inflation, a reacceleration of inflation. And, there's a lot of chatter right now on Twitter about different charts and things, but we
know the chart you're talking about.
But the main point is, it's not, what's important to remember is it's not unheard of in U.S. experience, in other high-income economies experience, that you go through a disinflation, you get most of the way there, another shock comes along, and inflation reaccelerates.
The bullwhip effect in prices.
To some degree, but it's also just if you're, and this is every good deed has its downside. If your labor market is like it is now, which is wonderful, which is unemployment measured below 4%, and labor force participation back up where it was before COVID for prime age workers, and you're anti-immigration, unfortunately, you get another shock, and it could just be an everyday shock. Gas prices go up, or suddenly because these investments in chips production start creating much more demand than we expect, you end up with inflation sooner and sharper. And the Chair Powell talked about that. The idea there's this, what he calls a nonlinear Phillips curve, right? That if you're close to a very full employment and there's a recent history of inflation may increase faster than you'd like. So that's another risk. And that would not be good going into the election. That would not be good in the past.
I was going to say, Tracy, the two big peaks of the Grand Tetons behind the hotel we're at, every time I look out them now, I'm like, that looks like the two peaks of inflation in that chart right now.
You see inflation risk on the horizon, literally on the horizon.
I see on the horizon that peak in the the mid 70s, the late 70s when I look out at the mountains.
Okay, well, I'm glad this was Adam's last sort of risk factor because it segs nicely into the discussion of how monetary policy should respond to the sort of fiscal policy that we're talking about. And I guess I'm trying to think how to ask this question, but you're an inside person at the conference. We are not. We are outside rejects, so we have to rely on you. We have to rely on you to convey.
I think the term is hangers-on.
Oh, there you go, hangers-on.
I say lobby people.
Okay, we're lobby people.
No, central bankers don't get lobbied.
So what are the discussions around fiscal policy in that room? Because on the one hand, it feels like, the actions of 2020, the unleashing of spending, maybe made central bankers' lives easier, at least in the short term. But now it seems like they're complicating them massively, especially if you don't know what industrial policy is going to look like in the future.
No, it's great that you brought it back. We are here at Jackson Hole, and Joe definitely should become a regular if he looks at the Tetons and sees inflation charts. I mean, that's real central banker psyche. Look, I think the starting point has to be, it is very awkward, and I've experienced this directly in the room, for central bankers to talk about fiscal policy. Because ultimately, if you're an independent central bank, which essentially all the free market countries have, the deal is politicians can complain about you, but they don't, or your policies, ideally not about you, but they don't interfere, in part because you don't go out and lecture them on what's not your responsibility if you're a central banker. So your responsibility is monetary policy and some parts of financial stability. And that's it. You're not supposed to be lecturing on fiscal policy. And in developing countries or countries where governance is not, those are not the same thing, but where governance is not as strong, you sometimes find central bankers feel they have to talk about fiscal policy and budgets and irresponsible policies, and it gets very awkward very quickly. So you don't want to do that if you don't have to. But as you're saying, there has been a shift towards more activist fiscal policy, and it's one thing during COVID, like you said, in 2020. You don't know what's going to happen. The world's facing a pandemic. You've seen unemployment spike. You've seen all kinds of things. And I think, frankly, somehow the Congress and the Trump administration and the Biden administration did largely decent policies in the emergency. I mean, maybe Secretary Mnuchin, I don't know who to credit, but they really did do basically good policies for 2020 and 2020, early 21. The issue is going forward from here. We're looking at a world where there's likely to be sustained increased public spending in all the major economies. So China, G7, including US. People are spending on industrial policy and these subsidies, wars, and investment. People should be spending on direct green investment to try to get some better traction on climate. People, unfortunately, should probably be spending more on defense, given the tensions given the behavior of Russia and the tensions with China. And you start adding all these up, and then all the stuff that our friends at the Peterson Foundation, which is separate but cousins of ours, so to speak, about demographics and long-term sustainability issues. You're seeing potentially 1.5%, 2%, maybe even 3% average higher public spending over the next several years of GDP. 3% of GDP. That's a big number. And no prospect that I see that the taxes are going to be raised to cover most of it. So that's a world that's very challenging for central banks. And how do you fit that in? And you say, so what was it like in the room? What was being discussed? Well, it's interesting that last year, actually, there was much more heated discussion and much more about this issue of could the Fed and others have raised sooner or more aggressively given what the fiscal policy was in the first quarter of 2021? Could they have adjusted more? Should they have adjusted more? And then if, and Gita Gopinath from the IMF raised this somewhat in her remarks last year, if there is this green transition, which includes a lot of spending, even just to adjust the economies, how should central banks react to it? I'm phrasing it all as a question because partly there are no easy answers and partly because there's no anything close to a consensus yet in the central banking community on this. There's a little bit too much of, well, we can't talk about that. That's not our job. But they're going to have to confront it. What I will say is so far this year, the discussions that I've heard are mostly about, in a sense, the questions of how this plays out into long-term interest rates and how this plays out into productivity growth. And those are the most important things for a central bank to think about for the long term, but they don't quite capture the political economy of this difficult game. And yeah, I wish I knew how to manage it.
Productivity. This investment in domestic manufacturing, domestic technology, things like that. Do you have any hope that maybe like productivity statistics, which I think have been pretty mediocre for a while, maybe gone down, could they reverse? Could a smart public investment, could we see a reversal on that?
The slowdown in productivity growth, which started in roughly 2004 and has been evident basically for the last 10, 15 years, is very concerning. Because the slowdown in productivity growth happened pretty simultaneously across all the high-income economies at once, it looks and smells like what we call a technology shock. So it isn't because the US underinvested in this, or Germany didn't have enough workers of that, or Japan got older faster. Since we all basically slowed down at about the same time, the same amount, it's probably something to do with what's global, which is technology. And the grim news about that is that puts you back in the world of the famous Robert Solow, the idea of what's called exogenous growth, that we don't really control it. So what I've always said is what you want to be doing is having the government buy really expensive lottery tickets. You invest in universities, you invest in promising technologies, you invest in infrastructure. There's no guarantee you're going to get the next big thing, as Michael Lewis puts it, at the other end, but it increases your chances. And this is like one of those good lotteries where there's only 1,000 tickets. They're really expensive, but if you win big. And that's the way to think of it. So then the question is the specific kind of spending they're doing on semiconductors and things like that the best kind of lottery ticket? I don't think so. It can't hurt, but I'd much rather have them investing in broader technologies than the specific industries.
I just have one last question, but I don't want to forget it. You mentioned an unpopular comment. Not many people say, maybe we need to invest more in defense. There's that book that came out a few years, Trade Wars Are Class Wars. But do trade wars lead to hot wars? And do you worry that if we did see spiraling tit for tat, subsidy raises trade, that actually it could become more of a geopolitical story?
Short answer, yes. I think the trade wars are class wars concept is actually a particular theory by
Pettis
and Klein, exactly. And I have some issues with it. We don't need to go into that.
We'll do a debate with them in D.C.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
Yeah, that'd be good.
All right, we'll make that happen.
If you want to make it happen, that'd be lovely. But I think the important thing is some of the Biden people like Pettis and Klein, have attacked the idea that sort of Tom Friedman worldview, that if we do lots of good globalization and trade, the world will become more peaceful. As with most things in social science, it's actually the reverse. It's not that if you do good things will result. It's if you do bad things, good things won't result. It's sort of the Obama don't do stupid bleep version of social science. So there's no guarantee that when we did trade liberalization that China was going to become this wonderful, peaceful, democratic place. There is a very high likelihood that if we have escalating barriers and sanctions and restrictions and hostilities in the economic sphere, that it will spill over and pump up hostilities in the military sphere. So you can argue quite reasonably, don't oversell the benefits of trade to peace and democracy, but you shouldn't undersell how much active economic conflict can spiral out of control and cause other geopolitical issues.
Hello， 大家好，欢迎关注华尔街电视频道。这期的热点深度关注陈一新。这个习近平的文胆现在成为国家安全部的沙皇，带领着国安部这个机构开始介入中国的外交政策。在9月初，习近平没有前往印度新德里的20国集团 G20 峰会，拜登得知后对此表示，我很失望，但我会见他。一般预料几个月后在美国旧金山举行的亚太经合会APEC 领导人峰会有可能会再次促成一场拜习会。那在北京时间的9月3日傍晚，中国国家安全部在其微信公众号发布文章，暗示说要真正实现从巴厘岛到旧金山，那美国需要拿出足够诚意。这篇文章指的是在2022年11月拜登和习近平在印尼的巴厘岛举行的 G20 峰会期间首度面对面接触，双方同意应该管理分歧，防止竞争演变成冲突。然而在2023年2月的中国间谍气球事件又使得两国关系跌落谷底。在这之后，拜登仍表达预期会和习近平见面。而中国国家安全部的文章称近期美国多名官员接连访华，并表示拜登政府无意遏制中国发展，不寻求与中国脱钩，愿同中方保持沟通，维护美中正常经贸关系，推动两国关系稳定发展。但与此同时，美方批准对台军售案，提供对台军事融资，继续在涉藏、南海等问题上是挑起事端，公开唱衰中国经济，这些体现出拜登政府对华战略明显的两面性特性，以及竞争与管控竞争。这篇文章最后还强调，中国绝不会因为美国的几句漂亮话放松警惕，美国的百般阻挠、遏制打压只会让中国愈战愈勇更加自强自立。路透社在报道中国国家安全部的这篇公众号文章时指出，目前尚不清楚作为中国主要情报机构的国安部是否了解或影响习近平对外交活动的考量。那一位中国时政观察家向华尔街电视频道透露陈一新入主国家安全部确实给这个部门带来了不一样的变化。现在的中国国家安全部是1983年经中共中央政法委员会秘书长、公安部部长刘富之的申请，中央决定是以中共中央调查部整体 公安部政治保卫局以及中央统战部部分单位、国防科工委部分单位为基础合并组建而成。上面提到的时政观察家进一步解释，公安部是从公安部分解出来而成立的，这就是国安部的先天不足。那上至国安部总部，下至国安部垂直单位各地方的安全厅的负责人，都是由不重要的角色担任。在1979年邓小平访美时，凌云被任命为安全工作小组副组长，并得到邓小平的赏识。1983年国家安全部成立之后邓小平是亲自拍板让凌云出任首任部长和党组书记。然而让凌云没想到的是，他的部长职位刚做了2年，就发生了他的下属于强生，也就是前中共政治局常委于正声的哥哥投奔美国事件。于强生的投美给中国不小的打击，也让邓小平对凌云非常不满。那试想国安部的人投美，那会抖出国安部部长凌云掌握的那些秘密吗？上面提到的时政观察家进一步解释，89天安门事件之后，公安部更是把政治保卫工作从国安部彻底拿走，国安部当时是越来越边缘化，而现在陈一新进入国安部，这意味着国安部的地位已经产生根本性的飞跃，国家安全成为了中国政治的核心。表面上陈一新担任的是不起眼的这个国家安全部部长，但这个部长和之前的任何一届国安部部长都不一样，陈一新的这个部长是更加接近中国权力核心的。2022年的10月底，中国全国人大常委会委员长栗战书当天在北京人民大会堂主持了第13届全国人大常委会第37次会议。会议决定免去陈文清的国家安全部部长职务，任命陈一新为国家安全部部长。公开资料显示，陈一新是物理专业的大专毕业生出身，但却以文字见长。1992年底，陈一新丽水地委办公厅是调到浙江省委办公厅，就任调研写作处的副处长，成为省官员的笔杆子。习近平当时到浙江之后陈一新是一直担任省委副秘书长，长期在习近平身边工作。2015年11月，他从温州市委书记任上奉召进入北京，出任中共中央深改小组办公室专职副主任。1年后空降湖北，出任省委的副书记兼武汉市委书记。在1年半之后重返北京，出任中共政法委的秘书长。而成为国安部的部长之后，陈一新的大动作之一就是接受习近平的指示，打击美国企业搜集中国的资讯的行为。在2023年的5月，华尔街日报引述知情人士指出，中国国家主席习近平是指派国安部部长陈一新负责对海外公司的打击行动，从国安角度有系统的整治美国企业收集中国信息的行为，显示出习近平重视国安高于经济增长。这场行动将打击外商对中国的投资信心。当时的报道就提到，据报道对众多跨国公司来说咨询和调查工作的尽职调查工作已变得越来越重要。根据当时的报道，对众多跨国公司的来说，这个习近平看来这些咨询公司的实地调查工作可能威胁国家机密的泄露，威胁到中共对中国国际形象的控制，还协助了美国及其盟友制定对华强硬政策。那为了便于扩大安全官员主导的主要针对外国的调查，中国最高立法机构还在4月底扩大了反间谍法的适用范围，使安全部门在检查涉嫌从事间谍活动者的行李和电子设备方面拥有更大权力。那《华尔街日报》是引述一个知情人士说，习近平一直在逐渐将政治议程的优先事项从经济发展转移，在这一过程中构建的整体政府框架侧重国内安全。习近平认为必须捍卫中国的意识形态和经济安全。上面提到的时政观察家向华尔街电视频道透露，最近进行的这个以国家安全为名的活动，比如抓间谍，未必是陈一新想做的，这是大的国家安全气氛下的一个必然动作。陈一新扮演的角色是体现出他得到习近平充分信任。陈一新在2020年初武汉疫情爆发后被调任中央应对新冠疫情工作领导小组指导组的副组长。那从中央政法委重回湖北武汉，这也说明陈一新不仅仅是习近平的文胆，陈一新可以在任何一个位置担任任何一个角色。现在陈一新是国安部的部长，潜台词那便是国家安全部变得更加重要， 国安部是国家安全委员会的执行机构，那这个机构的老大便是习近平，那这个是整个国家安全的一部分。如果没有任何意外的话，那陈一新的角色，这个是中国未来大安全系统的一个主导者，甚至他未来跳升进这个政治局，做政治局委员，进入政治局常委，那也是很有可能的。
What do we get wrong when we think about the legacy of Deng Xiaoping?
Almost every time we see the name Deng Xiaoping, we see two things. First, that he deserves credit for starting Reform and Opening at the famous Third Plenum in 1978. And second, that having learned the lessons of Mao's strongman rule, that it was necessary for the party to establish real institutionalization and inter-party democracy. I think that both of those assessments are now dated based on the new information that we have. The book shows that in the early years after the Cultural Revolution, there was a great deal of consensus within the party that they needed to change things drastically to save the revolution. And one of the individuals who believed that was Hua Guofeng, who was Mao's named successor and head of the party and military and the government for the first few years after Mao's death. Deng told a story that Hua was opposed to reform to legitimate his own case to be the top leader. And Deng was motivated not so much by differences in policy with Hua, but a contestation about who deserved to lead the party, who had the most credibility and legitimacy because of when they joined and what they did during the revolution. And in that sense, Hua simply could not compete with Deng Xiaoping. And in fact, the way that Deng engineered Hua's removal showed just how much Deng didn't really care about even the ambiguous rules that the party had. In one case, he met with dozens of people while Hua Guofeng was overseas. So it wasn't this story of having institutions channel popular opinions within the elite and that there were these competing policy platforms and inter-party democracy produced the more popular Deng because people liked his ideas better. It was more about different views of history and personal antagonisms and the manipulation of ambiguous rules, and especially in the case of Deng Xiaoping, who controlled the military. And of course, Deng demonstrated to the party that he was in charge of the gun, and that was a critical part of this contest. And one of the reasons that I look at this particular moment is because it's during these periods of political contestation that you can get a really good sense of how things really work. And so in a sense, this time of Deng's ascension provided clues to how he would rule for the rest of that decade. And this was a period in which Deng did not stand out for liberal pro-reform characteristics, especially with regards to political reform and ideology. And also, he very clearly believed that the Chinese Communist Party's advantage, especially with regards to the West, was that they had this decisive leader who could force through decisions without having to worry about what many in the party call parliamentary politics, which they disdain.
What's fascinating about Deng is that when we think about his legacy, we think of him not as a democratizer, but at least as an institutionalizer, somebody who brought in stronger institutions into China that allowed us to see smoother transitions of power as we look at Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao and now Xi Jinping. It seems like that's one of Deng's legacies, but it doesn't completely match how he actually governed, because he never actually ruled under an actual institutional power. I mean, he was always kind of in the shadows, if you will. He was never the chairman of the party. He wasn't president of China. For somebody who's known as an institutionalizer, he didn't really embrace institutions in order to actually govern. And so in a lot of ways, your book kind of clarifies some of that, because it explains how he wasn't really focused on institutions and he wasn't this great institutionalizer that we all think of him.
So, Justin, people often describe Xi Jinping as someone who deinstitutionalized the party after Deng created them. But in fact, I think Xi Jinping is more of an institutionalizer than Deng. They both clearly see the party as a system that needs a core, But Xi Jinping believes that the system needs a core, and for the core to also be in charge of the daily affairs of the party and the government. In the Deng era, and also during the Mao era, the fact that the person who was in charge was not always the person making day-to-day decisions was a recipe for disaster. And in fact, if anybody understands that, it's probably Xi Jinping, because his father, who was the right-hand man to Zhou Enlai in the State Council during the 1950s, and then the right-hand man to Hu Yaobang in the Secretariat during the 1980s, appreciated the extent to which Mao's troubled relationship with Zhou Enlai and Deng's troubled relationship with Hu Yaobang that was a result of this sort of two-line system was something that was disastrous for the party. It was something that contributed both to policy dysfunction, but also the third rail of Chinese politics for decades, the succession issue. And the problem is that even when you have deputies that are absolutely loyal to the top leader, if you don't get the politics right, even if you don't oppose, again, the top leader, you can still get into a lot of trouble. So I think you could make a case that Xi Jinping's model of ruling is a reaction to those pathologies of under-institutionalization during the Mao and Deng eras. Now, that's not saying that Xi Jinping has solved those problems. You could make a case that some of the problems that the party is facing right now has to do with the fact that Xi Jinping is trying to run everything at once. We actually know very little about, I think, policymaking under the Xi Jinping era, but it raises questions when you have a system that one person is trying to make so many decisions. And so when you look at the Deng era, one of the problems was that the Politburo Standing Committee didn't even meet. And the reason the Politburo Standing Committee didn't meet was because Deng Xiaoping didn't want to give other revolutionary elders an opportunity to even speak. And what that meant was the Secretariat, which was run by Hu Yaobang and Xi Jinping's father, was making a lot of decisions. And that contributed to Hu Yaobang's fall in 1987, because a lot of revolutionary elders thought that the Secretariat was running its own show, which they didn't like, and didn't think that Hu Yaobang was doing a good enough job consulting with them. But of course, when you're not even having Politburo Standing Committee meetings, it's not clear just exactly who you need to listen to more and who not to. So it just became very, very difficult to manage. So this is a little bit of a different view of the differences and similarities between Xi Jinping and Deng Xiaoping. But, party history is hard to get right. And Deng Xiaoping wanted the narrative to be the narrative that we have in the West of him being an institutionalizer. But like in so many other cases, the narratives that the Chinese themselves have put out to justify power struggles that were actually more distasteful than they like to say was something that was accepted. And I think now we need to sort of move slowly past that and recognize that we got some things wrong.
So let's move backwards then. Let's contrast the way that Deng Xiaoping is governing with his immediate predecessor, which was Mao's handpicked successor, Hua Guofeng.
So Hua Guofeng has a bad reputation. And one of the reasons for that is, after he was deposed, one of the stories told about him was that he tried to recreate a sort of lighter version of Mao's personality cult. But we now know that Hua Guofeng actually was somebody who really took consensus decision-making seriously and was one of the rarest individuals in Leninist system history to believe that you could function and should function in a consultative fashion. And this is interesting not just from a historical perspective, but from a political science perspective, in the sense that a lot of people believe that in these Leninist systems, you have a group who get to decide the leader, and they pick the leader because that leader is popular and they think that the leader will listen to them. But here we see Deng Xiaoping, who is someone who did not have a democratic sensibility, defeating Hua Guofeng, who actually did listen to people. And in fact, that he did listen to people contributed to his popularity. But unfortunately for Hua Guofeng, these are not popularity contests. And what's interesting is when it was understood that Deng Xiaoping was moving against Hua Guofeng, people who were close to him believed that Hua could have put up a bigger fight. People often think that Hua Guofeng was a nobody and that his fall was inevitable. But he was head of the military and the party, and in an extraordinarily leader-friendly system, that means a lot. Now, Deng might have been able to come out on top anyways, but Hua had seen decades of political infighting damage the party, and for someone whose entire life was the party, he decided, to his credit, that he didn't want to put the party through it again by putting up a fight against Deng Xiaoping, even though he was counseled by quite prominent figures and powerful figures to do so.
It comes across to me that being a compromiser, the way that Hua was, really became a disadvantage under a Leninist, communist-style party system. Why was a compromiser at a disadvantage to somebody who had a more authoritarian personality?
So I think the important thing to keep in mind here is that these are systems that do not select leaders based on popularity, that these are not systems that select people because their policy platform or their promises of benefits or patronage happen to be better than other people. That's not the coin of this realm, right? The coin of this realm, especially during the eras I talk about in this book, how much you contributed to the revolution, when you joined the revolution, what battles you won, whether you demonstrated an ability to see deeper, think better. And for Hua Guofeng, who joined the party much later than people like Deng Xiaoping and Chen Yun, and who was promoted rapidly during the Cultural Revolution, which was hated by these old revolutionaries, you can see why they wouldn't respect him all that much. But also, another element to keep in mind here is how much compromising material mattered. So when you are in charge during the Cultural Revolution, that makes you vulnerable to accusations that you were loyal to elements of it that maybe you didn't actually feel all that positive about. And I think that there was a lot of ambiguity among these older revolutionaries about whether or not Hua Guofeng was different from people like the Gang of Four. And this also gets into the heart of Leninist systems, which is there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of ability for you to mischaracterize what other people think, what other people have done, and that you can play these games, and there's not really like an open atmosphere where you can confront this kind of thing and explain why it's wrong. Also, Deng Xiaoping had a very special relationship with the military. I mean, this was a guy, Deng Xiaoping, who fought in the famous Huaihai campaign that smashed the nationalists in one of the most decisive battles of the war, during which he was in charge of a joint operation of 2 field armies. So he had that kind of cachet, specifically with the people who do get to decide which of these ambiguous rules are the ones that are going to get listened to. But also, I think that after decades of underground work and revolution, you come to a point where a lot of people within this kind of system really do believe that you can only get something done, and that includes regime survival, if you have somebody that everybody commonly understands to be the top dog. And what's so interesting about the 1980s is that people understood that one of the reasons Mao's strongman rule was a disaster was that nobody could stand up to him. At the same time, they believed that the party still needed a core to survive. So you had all these people still doing what Deng wanted, even when they really disagreed with what he was doing, because they thought that meant putting the party's interests first, and often that means putting the prestige of the top leader first to save the party.
So I was fascinated with the way that you described Hua as very much a compromiser, that this interregnum between Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping is really a much more collaborative period. I don't want to say democratizing, because it was collaborative between high-level elites. And it mirrors what happens over in the Soviet Union, where the interregnum between Stalin and Khrushchev, which again is another period that I kind of get lost in, and I think your book clarified a lot. That interregnum is again a very collaborative period. Can you explain a little bit about how leadership worked between those 2 periods, from when we're going from the death of Stalin until Khrushchev really consolidates power?
So in both China and the Soviet Union, there was a sense after Mao and Stalin died that we can't ever let this happen again. This was a disaster. But as I said, we can't essentialize that as something that had a determinative effect, precisely because it coexisted with another sensibility that it's really useful to have one person in charge, and that those practices had grown out of the revolution and the nature of a Leninist system, but also that these Leninist systems are places where, as I said, they're not popularity contests, and they're very leader-friendly for somebody who wants to pursue that position. But you're right, in the Soviet Union, just like in China as well, there was a period where people hoped that things would be run differently. and that there would be more collective leadership. And so when it comes to Khrushchev, right, a lot of people think of him as this sort of good guy reformer who wanted to overcome the Stalinist legacy. In fact, when the majority of the Presidium, which is what they called the Politburo at that time, tried to remove him in 1957, they were saying that they were trying to stop Khrushchev from creating a new dictatorship. And in fact, the evidence shows that they were right, that Khrushchev was arrogating a lot of power. He was kneecapping these individuals in a way that they thought was deeply inappropriate. And Khrushchev was taking either small tactical differences and supersizing them and turning them into a political weapon, or making up differences when they weren't even there, or completely mischaracterizing differences as part of a weapon. And then he turns things around and says, you were the ones who were Stalinists because you were the ones who committed all of these crimes during the Stalin era. And of course, Khrushchev had committed those crimes too, but he was the one who had a good relationship with the KGB. He was the guy who had a good relationship with the Minister of Defense Zhukov, who had all of this prestige as a great war leader. So we took those KGB documents and he put them in the hands of Zhukov, had Zhukov summon an emergency Central Committee plenum, and then start the show by, accusing all of these old guards of trying to restore the Stalinist purges, even though they were trying to stop Khrushchev from arrogating dictatorial powers.
That raises a question for me. I mean, when we think about Khrushchev and his conflict with other aspiring elites in the Soviet Union, or we think about Deng Xiaoping and his conflicts with Hua, what really were these conflicts about? I mean, was it debates about the direction of where the country should be going policy-wise? Was it just pure power? I mean, what were they fighting over?
So the common view of these periods is that Khrushchev and Deng represented coherent policy platforms that were different from the views of other people, and there were these struggles within the party, and ultimately Khrushchev and Deng won because people liked their platforms better, and that this was a story of a victory of collective leadership and inter-party democracy. And a lot of political scientists like to contrast Mao and Stalin as strong leaders with Khrushchev and Deng as more consultative leaders. And I don't want to essentialize all four of these leaders as essentially the same thing, because they weren't, but they were all very strong leaders. And these were all leaders who essentially were not ruling based on some promise of a set of policies that were part of a contract within the elite. That's just not how it worked. I think that personality matters here to a certain extent, and this is something that I try to get into the book, which is challenging because, as you said, I try to combine both history and political science, but it's necessary to show that Khrushchev and Deng were people who were jealous of power, who wanted power, who believed that assuming power was good for the revolution. Of course, it's a useful thing to believe, maybe, but I think it's probably also a legitimate one. I think that these were true believers. I don't think that they were sort of opportunists in the sense that they were using communism to get ahead for their own purposes. I don't think that's the case. And as they pursued those positions, what they did was, as I described a little bit earlier, they used compromising material, they lied, they mischaracterized other positions. They made special partnerships with the power ministries, by which I mean, of course, the political police and the military. Political police because they have guns, but also because they have compromising material, and the military because they have a lot of guns. And they could manipulate rules in a way that benefited them because the rules weren't especially clear or unarbitrarily enforced. And as I said, this was still a system where people could appreciate the benefits of having a strong leader, but also understood how dangerous it would be to contest a strong leader in a system that you dedicated your entire life to, and that you appreciated would only make the situation worse if you tried to do something about a top leader who was doing something that you didn't like, because you always put the party's interests first, and you're probably scared.
Were the policy changes that happened during these eras, I mean, are these inevitable then? Because one of the contentions in the book was that Hua actually began some of the economic openings that Deng gets credit for. Another one of the contentions you make is that Khrushchev's de-Stalinification is overblown, and that he leans back into Stalinification later on, and that seems to be a more popular direction for the party to take. I mean, were the policy directions, the ideas that actually get put into place in terms of public policy? I mean, are those just inevitable directions that any of the leaders would have ended up taking anyway?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And as I mentioned earlier, the debate about possibilityhood and different paths, this is something that gets a lot of attention for scholars of the Soviet Union and China. It is clear in the Chinese case that there were very different opinions within the elite about how far you wanted to go and how fast, but also just a lot of confusion about what the right path would be. So, for example, Deng Xiaoping told someone in an interview that nobody can really say what socialism is. So when you have that level of different opinions and you have that level of confusion, but also this interplay of contingency and different leaders having different levels of power, I don't want to say that it was inevitable, but you can also point to a pretty commonly held view within China after the Cultural Revolution that they had screwed up. Everybody knew it. Even Mao knew it, actually. If you look at what he says in the later years of the Cultural Revolution, even he understood what a huge disaster it was and went to find Deng Xiaoping in 1975 and asked him to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. But then he was afraid that Deng was going too far too fast in a way that challenged the legacy of the Cultural Revolution. Now, of course, as I was saying earlier, Deng Xiaoping thought he was doing exactly what Mao wanted him to do. He just got it wrong. And part of that has to do with Deng's sort of stubbornness and pig-headedness, and even people would go up to him and say, do you think you really understand what Mao wanted? And Deng said, yeah, I do. But he didn't, obviously. But he was doing what he did because even Mao understood that things had screwed up and things needed to get fixed. So in the Soviet Union, this question of Stalin is really interesting, right? Because de-Stalinization can mean a lot of different things. It can mean whether you're actually moving away from Stalin's policies and practice, and that ranged everything from the economy to the purges to foreign policy, but it also depended on sort of the official evaluation of Stalin. So it's pretty clear that there was consensus among the leadership about the need to move away from Stalin's policies in practice. And on the question of Stalin, there were differences, but they weren't as absolute as many people think. So at the 20th Party Congress in 1956, there was a pretty common view that something needed to be said somehow, because otherwise you couldn't justify all of these rehabilitations. But also there was a fear that if you didn't take the initiative, what would happen if people in the party confronted you later? So when Khrushchev gave the secret speech, he said some pretty awful things about Stalin, and it was very destabilizing. But the official party position on Stalin came out later, and that was much more pro-Stalin. It put his contributions first. And so when Molotov, who is usually seen as the pro-Stalin guy who opposed Khrushchev because he didn't want to criticize Stalin, in his letters to the leadership after he was purged, he says repeatedly, I also agreed we needed to acknowledge the mistakes that Stalin made. What I didn't agree with was saying that Stalin was such a bad person that he didn't do anything right. And then he noted, well, look at the official position made in 1956. And that position came out because Khrushchev so quickly after the secret speech shifted and started making very sort of pro-Stalin noises, which means that, this is the most important thing, by 1957, when the move against Khrushchev is launched, Khrushchev had already tacked back to a pretty pro-Stalin position in the sense of the official characterization of Stalin. And people at that plenum note this, that they're talking about Khrushchev as somebody who's defending Stalin's memory and legacy. Now, of course, after the so-called anti-party group is destroyed, Khrushchev is much more vocal in the ensuing years about de-Stalinization, and Stalin is removed, of course, from the tomb in 1961. But by that point, it doesn't have anything to do with power politics anymore. But one thing to keep in mind is that after the anti-party group was destroyed, there was no further rehabilitation of people. It wasn't like, now they're gone, now we can do even more rehabilitations. And in fact, the rehabilitations that preceded the coup against Khrushchev, we have no evidence that Molotov was especially opposed to them, and in fact supported most of them and played a role in these rehabilitations.
When we normally think about Soviet history, there's kind of an assumption that when Stalin died, everybody had a deep exhale, that they were happy to be out from under this totalitarian dictator that people portray as this just absolute terror on the people. Your book definitely gives the impression that that's not the way that people felt, particularly elites within the Soviet Union. Why is it that people like Molotov and others had a much more positive view of Stalin? What is it that they appreciated about him that people in the West just aren't going to get?
What's interesting about Mao and Stalin is the people who knew them had extraordinarily complicated emotions about these leaders. And it's very difficult to say whether they were pro-Stalin, anti-Stalin, pro-Mao, anti-Mao. I mean, these figures were larger than life in a way. I mean, these figures were the regimes. They were the victories of these regimes, and the lives of their comrades were tied up in it in a completely fundamental way. So what that meant was you would both deeply respect these leaders, you would have deep emotional attachments to them, but at the same time, that did not mean you were completely incapable of self-reflecting about their mistakes. So one example of this is Xi Jinping, the father of Xi Jinping. This was someone who was deeply devoted to Mao's memory. This was someone who believed that Mao saved his life during a purge in 1935 within the Communist Party. This was someone who was persecuted by Mao 4 years before the Cultural Revolution even started. One of his daughters was persecuted to death during the Cultural Revolution. And in private conversations, Xi Jinping was extremely vocal about how disastrous the Cultural Revolution was. He talked about how it was necessary to prevent a new strongman from appearing, but he was also someone who publicly and privately would affirm Mao's legacy and contributions and criticize people who he thought didn't have the right to say negative things about Mao. So for people who try to sort of categorize them as, one faction or another or something like that, these are people. These are individuals who are complicated.
So when we're studying these transitions from these just larger-than-life figures, Stalin and Mao, are these transitions representative of something that we see happen time and again in authoritarian regimes? Because when we think about future transitions in China, for instance, it seems like the transitions have been relatively smooth. I mean, from Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao to Xi Jinping, it doesn't feel like this is the story that we see happen over and over again. And even within the Soviet Union, I don't think we've seen something that was this kind of gray period that is hard to understand what's actually happening. So what is it that we're really describing when we're comparing these two periods in history, and when would we expect them to reoccur?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So there's two ways of thinking about this question. One is whether it relates specifically to China and Russia, or whether you're asking about authoritarian regimes more broadly. As I say in the book, I'm not arguing that there are no institutions at all. I'm arguing that institutions just mattered in ways that we didn't appreciate previously. So in that sense, Leninist regimes, I think, are different from other authoritarian regimes. One reason for that is, as I already described, these are all-encompassing organizations in the sense that your whole life's meaning is sort of tied up with your membership of these Leninist parties. So when you lose in a power struggle, you don't go start a new revolution because everybody really cares about, no matter how things go down, it doesn't affect regime stability. Which is why when people were being executed during the Stalin era, they would say, "Long live Stalin." I'm not exaggerating, as they were facing the end of their lives. Also, when you win these power struggles, you very often do everything you can to make them look more legitimate and about other things than they really were. And that's one of the reasons why we have these sort of wrong ideas about a lot of these transitions, is because they actually really care about looking good, within their own parties. And finally, even though the military really matters a lot in these cases, it's not the military versus the party. It's that there's a crisis within the party, which creates an opportunity for the military to play a more prominent role. So in that sense, I want to talk a little bit about what political scientists call scope conditions, about whether or not these kinds of arguments apply to non-Leninist regimes. I talk a little bit about, commonalities and succession within the book when I describe the succession after Lenin dies. So people who are interested in that, I can show there's at least one other case in these countries I describe where my understanding of how these things works. also applies. In terms of China, you described, post-Deng transitions. We know very little about them, especially for the Jiang Zemin and the Hu Jintao eras. We already have these sort of views of them. But as somebody who sees how often the views that happen at the time are wrong, I guess I feel that there's a lot of iceberg that we can't see, and that probably our understanding of the Jiang Zemin and the Hu Jintao eras will shift as more evidence comes out. I talked a little bit about how there are still puzzles of the 1980s, but we know a lot about the 1980s, especially compared to the 1990s in China, for reasons that actually have a little bit to do with the power struggles within China, such that people who lost out on these battles would go and publish in like Hong Kong, or people who really liked certain leaders would leak documents out that then were published in places like Hong Kong or the United States. Some of those people even left China and they went to the United States or other Western countries and people could interview them. And also there was this period during the Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao eras where even within China, you could publish stuff in these party history journals on everything from the Great Leap Forward to the Cultural Revolution to June of 1989. We have a little bit on the 1990s, but we have almost nothing on the 2000s, unfortunately. And if you read this article by Fred Tevis called The Black Backs of Chinese Politics, he sort of goes through and says what people were saying about Chinese politics at the time and then shows how, they mostly just got it wrong. And not because they're dumb or because, they're coming at it from perspectives that are just totally out there. One of the most interesting things that I also describe in the book is how people, even within the system, at the very top of the system, also were getting these things wrong. So just because you're reading something that's wrong in a memoir doesn't mean that the person who's writing it is lying. It means that maybe they didn't get it either. And that doesn't mean that the memoir shouldn't be read. It just means that it should be used as evidence in a particular way.
It's almost impossible not to try to draw parallels to contemporary Russia and China today. I mean, as reading the book, you're constantly thinking in the back of your mind, does any of this apply to what would happen when Putin leaves power in Russia, especially if he stays in office until he's dead or until he's not able to really name a true successor? You think in terms of China, I mean, Xi Jinping's now in his third term, and it kind of raises the question that he doesn't have an obvious successor. So how's that going to play out? Are we going to see a recurrence of the kind of scenario that you describe here after the fall of Stalin and Mao? And China still has the Communist Party in place. It still has that key institution. Russia does not. So it raises the question in my mind, how much of a role you think those institutions do play when we see these leadership transitions and when we might see leadership transitions from, again, leaders who've been in power for an incredibly long time, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, those are really interesting insights and questions. When it comes to what history tells us about the present, looking at the past gives me two sensibilities. One is, wow, I can sort of feel how much I don't know. And that is a lesson to us about how much we think we can discern from publicly available information. And it also suggests that even information that people whisper to us may be wrong too, and they may not necessarily be lies. But the second thing that looking to the past makes me feel is that if you get a sense for how things work, that's really useful. Let me give you an example. So during the Xi Jinping era, people have sometimes suggested that a new line was being pushed by one of his deputies. Every case that I've looked at from the past where people on the outside thought that there was a power struggle at the top represented in two different lines, that was wrong. And again, people still think of Chinese history as this two-line struggle because that's the story the Chinese tell. But everything from Mao Zedong's relationship to Liu Shaoqi to anything that happened during the 1980s, it was not a problem of competing policy platforms. It was a problem of getting the politics of your relationship with the top leader right when it was hard to guess what they were thinking and they were changing their mind and they were suspicious of you. So again, I mean, back then and now, people wonder whether there are these different lines. And certainly there are tactical differences and people in different positions sort of have different obligations. But generally speaking, within the top leadership, They are both so leader-friendly, and there is such a reason for everybody at the top to pursue consensus. I doubt when people make these claims about visible policy differences. I also doubt that when Xi Jinping makes mistakes, or when Xi Jinping picks a policy that maybe people don't like, that has implications for his authority, for all the reasons we've been discussing. And that counterintuitively, if you think that a core is necessary to achieve regime stability, you will think that even more when the top leader is screwing up, because you don't want the entire house of cards to come down.
So recently we've seen leadership changes in China in terms of the top diplomat in China has disappeared. And two top military officials in terms of the, I think it's the rocket division.
People's Liberation Army Rocket Forces, yeah.
Yeah. What does that say to you in terms of what the struggles are like right now in China? And I know we're looking inside of a black box, but based on what you've learned in terms of Chinese history, what do those leadership changes say to you about what's happening at this current moment?
Well, again, the first thing to say is I don't know. And that's a lesson I derive from looking at the past and how hard it's been for people to guess what's going on within the system. But the other thing I can say is that looking to the past, one of the hardest things to explain to people, because it's so counterintuitive, is why you have these power struggles when you have such a dominant leader already and who's been leading the country for such a long time. Because you would think that you would have power struggles because of policy differences, or because of different views, or because of competing factions, or people who don't like Xi Jinping, or something like that, right? But really often, as I was saying before, even when the leader is totally dominant, you can still screw up. Why? Well, because there may be other people in the system who don't like you, but also because when you have a leader who pursues multiple goals at once, it's hard to guess whether you're doing the right thing, especially if the top leader changes their mind, because leaders are politicians and they shift and they move around. And Xi Jinping is someone who is, this is a phrase that Chris Buckley just used with me in a conversation, polyvocal. So again, like the Deng Xiaoping era, right? He cared about economic development, but he was also a political conservative. And so some people would say, look, your political conservatism is hurting the economy. Or people who thought that political opening was challenging, regime legitimacy, that would say, hey, we're going too far. You need to come out and repeat the 4 cardinal principles, which is this sort of conservative formulation, right? But also, when you're tasked with difficult things, and I think that the rocket forces was probably tasked with a really hard thing, which is to build up the rocket forces really quickly, there's places there to screw up. And so, Xi Jinping has this very interesting view of the world, and you can see it in his conversations with the military, that the more powerful China becomes, the more brazen the United States will try to arrest China's rise, because they cannot accept a superpower guided by a different ideology. So what that means is you have to constantly keep your eye on the ball. You have to constantly recognize that even your most trusted lieutenants are vulnerable to mistakes, to corruption, to not taking your directive seriously enough. So we don't know whether any of the things I just mentioned have anything to do with the foreign minister or the rocket forces. But the situation I've described hopefully can suggest to you why it's still so hard to operate effectively and safely in a system with a top leader that is dominant as Xi Jinping.
Joseph, one of the most interesting quotes in the entire book that really just kind of struck me was where you write, the Deng era was emphatically one of continued strongman rule. Tragically, the Mao era had not been overcome. And when we think about Xi Jinping, there's been a lot of writings that talk about his rule as a Maoist revival. But I think your perspective in that quote would be that it's not a revival. The Mao era just simply has not been overcome still. And I think we can think about that the same way in Russia, that in a lot of ways, the Stalinist era has not completely been overcome with Putin. Do you agree with that statement, that we still haven't overcome those eras? And if so, what do we need to do to overcome those eras?
Yeah, there's this really amusing movie from the Soviet era called Repentance, where this figure who looks like Stalin keeps coming back to life over and over again. So for people who want to get a sort of cultural view of Stalinism that's not the death of Stalin, they can go check out that movie. And There's this expression that China won't escape from the Maoist era until Mao's visage in Tiananmen Square is removed. And you're right that one of the messages of my book is that Leninist systems have always been very leader-friendly, and that we need to stress more continuities with the past than many people do when they, use this refrain of Deng Xiaoping being somebody who was a reformer and dismantled the Mao strongman system. At the same time, I don't want to essentialize Stalin or Mao, and I don't want to say that nothing has changed, because that's not true. And again, as I was talking about with de-Stalinization earlier, when you use phrases like that, you need to say specifically what you mean, because Stalin and Mao represent very different historical memories and legacies. So often, as you said, we see this claim that Xi Jinping is a Maoist, survivalist. As I describe in my biography of Xi Zhongxun that's coming out, I think that a lot of what Xi Jinping is doing is because he doesn't want another cultural revolution to happen, because he thinks it was a complete unmitigated disaster. Now, what's ironic is that many of the steps that Xi Jinping has taken to prevent what his idea of a cultural revolution is, and it's sort of vague, it's basically just state collapse. Basically, it just means when people are given too many freedoms, they do whatever they want to, and that involves beatings and kidnappings and that kind of thing. But the things he does to stop that from happening again, many people think look like the Cultural Revolution, because it means struggle in the way that I just described to you, this idea that the danger never goes away and you need to continue to fight it. So people say that the Chinese history is a story of two lines of good guys and bad guys. And the reason I challenge that is because where you divide that line has always been arbitrary and shifting. And even the same person on different issues can look more or less like a radical. So whether you say Xi Jinping is going too far or not far enough is a politically contested one, in the sense that Xi Jinping himself probably thinks that he's not going as far as the Cultural Revolution because he thinks it was such a disaster. But other people say that precisely by trying to stop another Cultural Revolution from happening, he's manifesting some of the worst things of the party that they had hoped were over after Mao died. Now, I have my own views on that, but it's certainly a situation in China where if you're a dissident or you were a Uyghur, it's rough.
欢迎您收看印度简报。沙特阿拉伯如何陷入美中核武器拉锯战的泥潭？英国每日电讯，中国向沙特阿拉伯提供了一个更便宜、更有吸引力的核能项目建设方案，有可能打压美国。中国的方案没有美国提出的任何条件，比如禁止沙特阿拉伯浓缩自己的油储备或在沙特领土上开采油矿，这些条件对于生产核武器是必要的。沙特阿拉伯正在考虑加入亲俄罗斯的贸易集团金砖国家合作机制的提议，这被视为沙特阿拉伯从传统上作为中东坚定亲西方盟友的潜在转变。据说沙特阿拉伯的王储穆罕默德·本·萨勒曼正在利用中美之间的竞争来最大化自己的影响力。然而，沙特阿拉伯仍然严重依赖美国的武器进口，王储已经表示希望与美国建立更深入的防务伙伴关系。在美国、沙特阿拉伯和以色列就潜在的正常化协议进行的谈判中，包括核能在内的议题也可能给中国带来复杂的局面。板球在奥运会中为何花了这么长时间？悉尼先驱晨报，板球有望正式加入奥运会，因为22板球已经被列入国际奥委会周五的会议议程。尽管国际奥委会高层多次支持，但由于印度和英格兰的自私原因，该运动一直未能引入奥运会。英格兰和威尔士板球委员会认为将板球引入奥运会将损害其夏季赛季，而印度板球管理委员会不希望受到印度奥委会的管辖。国际板球理事会估计，8月上旬的奥运会可能会给英格兰和威尔士板球委员会带来 1.3 亿美元的损失，并需要 1.6 亿美元的补偿。板球加入奥运会将有助于该运动与南亚人口更好的互动，并赋予其奥运会的信誉。该运动的加入还将为国家板球计划带来额外的资金，并帮助那些试图进入板球全会员行列的国家。阿尔巴尼亚正在权衡与东南亚国家达成开放天空协议，而卡塔尔的争议仍在继续。悉尼先驱晨报，澳大利亚政府正在考虑与东南亚国家如印度尼西亚追求开放天空协议，该协议将为相关国家之间的航空公司提供无限制的进入权。这是澳大利亚总理安东尼· 阿尔巴内斯加强与该地区关系计划的一部分。澳大利亚机场协会表示，马来西亚、菲律宾、泰国和越南应该受到特别关注。目前，澳大利亚与美国、中国、印度、新加坡、新西兰和日本有开放天空协议。为什么一个以范文名字称呼印度的 G20 邀请引起了一些争议？ CNN 在 G20 晚宴邀请函上使用范文名字 Bharat 引发了印度的政治争议和公众对该国名称和殖民遗留问题的讨论。在14亿人口的印度，印度和 Bharat 两个名称都被官方使用，但在莫迪总理及其印度教民族主义政党印度人民党的领导下，印度在国际舞台上使用 Bharat 作为命名规范的改变是显著的。莫迪政府一直努力解脱印度的殖民包袱，通过更名与印度的殖民和莫卧儿过去有关的道路和建筑物。美国宇航局的月球轨道器拍摄了印度的月球着陆器的照片。BBC 美国国家航空航天局发布了一张印度月球着陆器维克拉姆在月球表面的照片。这张照片是由美国国家航空航天局的月球勘测轨道器上的相机拍摄的。照片中，维克拉姆在照片中央只是一个小点，它的黑暗阴影在明亮的光晕中可见。维克拉姆于8月23日降落在月球南极附近，使印度成为第一个在该地区实现软着陆的国家。着陆器和月球车在月球表面停留了大约10天，然后进入休眠模式，直到它们的电池可以通过阳光重新充电。马尔代夫选举可能成为中印竞争的关键。路透社，马尔代夫即将举行的总统选举将决定中国和印度在对印度洋岛链的影响力竞争中谁能占上风。现任总统伊卜拉欣·穆罕默德·索利赫倾向于与印度保持密切联系，他在民意调查中稍微领先。他的主要竞争对手穆罕默德穆伊祖得到了与中国关系密切的联盟的支持，并发起了一场印度滚出去的运动。然而，国内关切，如管理国家债务负担，预计对选民的影响力将超过大国竞争。印度与马尔代夫有着长期的联系，而中国在其“一带一路”倡议的基础设施项目上投资巨大。卢比因对美国收益率和油价的担忧而下跌，人民银行受到关注。路透社，由于对美国国债收益率和油价上涨的担忧，印度卢比对美元汇率跌至2周低点。卢比对美元的最新报价为 83.0775， 较前一交易日的 83.04 下跌。卢比跌破83水平并不是新鲜事，关键在于印度储备银行 RBI 的反应。美国国债收益率在一位美联储官员的评论后大幅上涨，强化了市场对政策利率可能保持较高水平的预期。沙特阿拉伯和俄罗斯延长了自愿减产，油价也大幅上涨。中国人民币也面临压力，对美元汇率录得 7.3248 的低点，因为中国国有银行被看作正在清理离岸外汇市场上的人民币流动性。美国敦促中国在 G20 峰会上不要扮演破坏者的角色。BBC 美国国家安全顾问杰克·沙利文呼吁中国在即将由印度主办的20国集团峰会上发挥建设性作用。沙利文的言论是在中国确认习近平主席不会出席会议后发表的。自从2020年印度和中国军队在有争议的喜马拉雅边界发生致命冲突以来，印度和中国之间的关系一直紧张。沙利文表示，中国是否想成为峰会的破坏者取决于中国自己，但他补充说，美国和其他20国集团成员将鼓励中国专注于解决问题，并为发展中国家提供帮助。该州有望成为美国首个禁止种姓歧视的州。卫报，加利福尼亚立法者已经批准了一项法案，该法案将使加利福尼亚成为第一个禁止基于种姓歧视的州。这一举措被视为尼泊尔、印度和孟加拉国等国家的个人提供额外的保护，这些个人以前未受到现有反歧视法律的保护。在成为法律之前，该法案现在需要加文·纽森州长的签署。近年来，加利福尼亚州出现了反种姓行动的增加，包括诉讼和将种姓列为反歧视政策中受保护的类别。印度外交部长表示，习近平和普京缺席 G20 峰会并不罕见。路透社，据印度外交部长苏布拉马尼亚姆·贾伊沙卡尔表示，中国国家主席习近平和俄罗斯总统弗拉基米尔 普京缺席新德里20国集团峰会与印度无关。他表示，他们决定不参加峰会，并不反映与印度存在任何问题。贾伊沙卡尔还承认，印度在应对受到疫情、冲突、气候变化、债务和政治影响的困难世界时面临的挑战。普京和习近平的缺席，以及对乌克兰战争的分歧，可能会使峰会难以达成一致的领导人宣言。今天的股市，亚洲市场大多下跌，因为油价上涨。美联社周三，随着交易员从长假周末回归，亚洲大部分股市下跌，紧随华尔街的下滑。日本的日经225指数上涨，但大多数其他地区市场下跌。原油价格上涨，增加了通胀压力，此时投资者希望看到央行放缓加息步伐。印度的英雄摩托公司将向电动汽车制造商 Ather Energy 再投资6600万美元。日经亚洲，全球最大的摩托车和踏板车制造商英雄摩托车公司宣布计划再投资55亿卢比6600万美元，在印度电动两轮车制造商 Ather Energy。英雄摩托车公司已经持有 Ather 33.1% 的股份，具体的股权比例将在 Ather 完成资本增资后确定。据报道，Ather 计划在2024年的首次公开募股之前，寻求约 2.5 亿美元的主要注资，估值为13亿美元。这项投资是在印度电动车市场继续增长的背景下进行的，推动因素包括燃油价格上涨、充电基础设施改善、政府补贴和环境问题。新西兰将寻求贸易多样化，因中国经济放缓 ，Hipkins 表示。彭博社，根据新西兰总理克里斯·希普金斯的说法，新西兰政府计划通过贸易多元化来保护其经济免受中国经济放缓的影响。中国对乳制品出口的需求下降对新西兰产生了影响。全球最大的乳制品出口商恒天然合作社表示，由于中国的采购减少，其对供应商的付款可能比去年少 17%。希普金斯还概述了工党的经济优先事项，包括通过追求更多自由贸易协定来扩大出口机会，其中印度是一个重点目标。印度总理利用 G20 峰会来宣传他的全球影响力，并在国内争取选民的支持。美联社，印度总理纳伦德拉·莫迪一直将于9月9日至10日在新德里举行的 G20 峰会作为推广自己形象的平台，以备战2024年的大选。此次活动还被用来展示印度的实力，许多纪念碑和机场都展示了 G20 标志，即一个地球在莲花内，这也是莫迪所在的印度人民党的象征。政府还组织了一系列展示印度对世界的贡献的活动，包括瑜伽和政府运营的数字交易系统。政治分析人士将莫迪描述为全球思想领袖和崛起中印度的代言人。此次峰会将为他提供一个与全球领导人会晤和交流的平台，包括美国总统乔·拜登。然而，皮尤研究中心进行的一项调查显示，40%的受访者对莫迪及其处理国际事务的能力缺乏信心。谢谢您的收看。上面播报的内容是六度团队推荐的全球专业媒体、智库、政府机构和行业专家的最新报道、分析简报，更详细的内容，请大家去这些媒体、智库的网站阅读。这些内容并不一定反映六度简报的立场，亦不能作为任何决策的建议。六度团队由专业媒体人、学者、科学家组成的独立新型媒体，大家可以根据自己的专业要求订阅各种简报，网址是6dobrief.com。您在世界任何地方 都可以通过电邮收到6度简报。
观众朋友们好，感谢大家来到今天的华尔街电视思想先驱报节目现场。今天呢，我们继续为大家聊外交方面的重要话题。如果你现在去印度，很有可能会看到20国集团峰会的现场。那么据彭博社的记者在现场看到的景象最引人注目的就是一尊巨大的印度教湿婆神塑，重达19吨，在会场的前方即将迎接20国集团峰会的各大领导人，就是我们现在在屏幕上看到的。根据彭博社记者的介绍这一尊名为纳塔拉甲的五像，总共高8.5米，由金银铁等各类金属锻造而成。莫迪对于这一位武神可以说情感十分的深厚。在2014年，莫迪自己进行上台典礼的时候，在恒河边就曾经供奉同一座湿婆神。湿婆神在印度教中有什么样的含义呢？根据来自彭博社的文章介绍，它既是毁灭之神，也是创造之神，同时也是变革之神。现在距离莫迪刚刚上台的2014年基本上整整10年，而莫迪在过去的10年中可以说在国内政治是非常富有争议的一个人物，但是在国际舞台上他却一再主导重新塑造印度的政治版图。现在印度已经成为华盛顿和北京之间的某一个支点，既不受制于任何一方，同时又在两方之间获取最大利益，也在整个全球发挥更大的地缘政治作用。印度的做法是出于什么样的动机呢？来自彭博社的报道引述消息人士说，实际上这是莫迪的一盘大棋，他想方设法地利用中美之间竞争的不断加剧，以及俄罗斯在乌克兰的战争，为印度争取更大的国际空间。在此前的华尔街论坛节目中，我们也为您介绍，印度可以说在整个国际舞台上既举足轻重，又态度暧昧。一方面拒绝谴责俄罗斯对于乌克兰的侵略，但同时也拒绝加入对于莫斯科的西方制裁阵营。与此相反，还一直在囤积俄罗斯的石油和武器，同时又在加强与美国的军事关系。不但是美国支持的四方安全集团中的重要支点，另外2个国家除了美国和印度是日本和澳大利亚，与此同时又是中国和俄罗斯主导的金砖国家阵营的重要一部分，几面都不得罪，在很多大国集团矛盾之间可以说游走的十分的巧妙。印度的这一种外交政策到底怎样来形容呢？一提到中国外交政策，大家往往想到的是叫战狼外交印度也有自己独特的外交政策，叫做什么呢？叫做杂耍外交。这不是我说的，而是印度现在的最高外交官印度外长苏杰生的原话。他说我们的这一种对冲是一种微妙的行为，一个舞者在空中要能够灵活地转动多个球，表现出他的自信和技巧的娴熟。最重要的是手里有很多球，但是一个球也不能掉在地上。在2019年的时候，印度曾经也有莫迪的一次演讲，在演讲中莫迪也强调了印度现在的外交政策。他说如果你不了解情况，你可能会觉得印度的做法让人费解。实际上，我们印度人不仅仅会解算术题，还会解微积分题。什么意思？就是说，有的时候这个国际关系你们想的是直白的直线条的1加2等于3， 3减1等于2。但是对于我们印度来说这是一个复杂的多的数学问题，是微积分级别的数学问题。来自彭博社的记者也认为，不管你对于莫迪政府的外交政策如何评价，现在这样的一种不选边而是骑墙的方针，其实呢，让印度处于地缘政治的某一个甜蜜地带。美国和盟国现在普遍在国际舞台上可以说是给足了印度的面子，认为印度是抗衡中国的重要力量。在经济领域，不管是苹果公司还是其他的美国科技公司，也在逐步部署在未来的30年到50年内向印度转移生产链的有关的举措。一方面是因为中国的人力成本不断提高，另外也是由于中国遇到的地缘政治逆风，认为中国+1的下一个备选地很有可能印度是重要的竞争者。 在这个印度这样的国家来看啊，本国的经济问题仍然是必须要解决的问题。但是现在印度与中国相比，已经有了人口方面的优势。很多西方国家也认为，印度是可以在气候变化等重要问题上进行合作的伙伴。而同时，如果中国和俄罗斯走向抱团的话，印度也成为发展中国家西方可以支持的一支重要的民主的力量。但是，印度与俄罗斯的关系也十分的微妙。比如在过去的几个月里，莫迪就邀请俄罗斯的投资者来参与印度的钢铁工业的建设。但是与此同时，印度总理莫迪又到了白宫，又到了巴黎的这个爱丽舍宫，和这个美国总统拜登以及法国的总统马克龙会面，并且受到了热情高级别的接待。美国的总统拜登甚至说，印度和美国是世界上最亲密的伙伴。普京在上周也吹捧了与印度特别优越的战略伙伴关系。这一次，普京不会在20国集团峰会上露面，习近平也不会露面。俄乌战争还在继续，而中国与印度之间的竞争也是没有半点放松的意义。印度如此能够走钢丝，印度能够在非常复杂的地缘政治局势中让一切为自己服务，这显然是十分特别的一点。那我想请问一下和平先生啊，印度现在处在这样的一个地缘政治的甜蜜地带，那么肯定一个重要的背景是中国的崛起以及西方对于中国的警惕。但是印度这样的地位到底是暂时的，还是有可能形成某一种长久的发展动力？这还是一个问题。平衡数到底只是一时的权衡之数，还是有可能成为印度未来一段时间发展的重要的战略支点呢？
我觉得印度在未来几十年毫无疑问是具有这个巨大的增长潜力的一个国家现在西方对这个印度的这个支持是出于他们的这个功利的目的并不是因为价值，也不是因为其他的原因，就是想支援这个中国，因为中国对西方的挑战的能量很大。那么所以印度是找到了一个非常好的这么一个机会印度存在都非常严重的人权问题、宗教问题，在西方看起来这个已经不是最关键的了。就像1972年中国那么迫害人权，中国的政治一塌糊涂，但是美国为了去牵制这个苏联，那个时候跟中国也打开了大门，几乎是一样的那么这个对于印度来讲当然是一个非常好的一个机会。同时呢，跟印度最近几年的外交战略和穆迪本人又是结合在一起。这个苏杰生就刚才你点名的这位外交部长他原来其实已经是差不多退休的一个外交官，他当过驻中国大使，也当过驻这个美国大使，可以说呢既了解中国，也了解这个西方，也了解美国。他在这个休息期间曾经写过一本书就是在一个全球化的过程中间，这么一个政治过程中间，印度什么角色？其实今天的印度的很多的外交的行为，就是他的书的一个实践的版。而在这个时候，印度又出现了一个穆迪这样的人，一个非常强势的一个领导人，他以这种印度的传统文化为自居，实际上他有一个非常具有讽刺的，对西方来讲是西方不敢讲的，就是实际上穆迪对西方有强烈的反感。印度的整个的现代化过程中间，实际上有一个去殖民化的一个过程，甚至他的名字，我们昨天嘛，就是李奇博士不错讲了这个名字的，给这个叫波罗多其实就是印度以前的一个国名，
对
就是一个传说，他们也用过这个国名，它也是一个以前的一个很厉害的一个国王的一个名字。其实对于印度来讲，我们觉得很奇怪，对吧？其实对于印度来讲，他们自己就是说，他们不是自己叫印度人，他们就是叫这个名字的这个人。所以有些东西是基于我们的不了解
不是那样的。这一点要特别强调， 这个名字在印度本身也引起了非常大的反对，因为它是
我讲的不是国民，我讲印度人他们习惯
应该说是印度教人
啊，对，印度人，因为印度是一个宗教文化语言非常这个庞杂的一个国家但是他现在的目的所强调的这一部分。就是印度人自己的
印度教人
印度教人他们认为呢这就是现在今天印度产生冲突的一个很重要的一个原因。
这就是我们接下来要讲的这一点
所以这个我觉得是这样的2点。第一点是印度有巨大的这个潜力，印度有非常好的哲学的基础，也有这个科学的基础，他的人才，他的表现方式就可以看得出来，加上他的人才的年轻化。加上它的人口又比较多所以这是毫无疑问的印度应该发展起来，也应该发展起来。但是印度的问题比中国的问题要复杂很多很多复杂很多很多。中共只是有一个短期的一个意识形态在中国的侵蚀暴力革命对中国的一个影响，从长远来讲，整个的传统文化还没有经过几十年得到完全的摧毁。印度不是摧毁的问题，印度是非常庞杂。你从它的电影，从它的这个新闻，你就可以发现那种冲突感觉是非常非常之强。印度的这种民粹印度的这种教义教派之争，印度这种区域之争，甚至是语言之争，印度连国语都没有的，他没有国家语言的。有的人就是我这里以前知不知道有一种语言那个使用的语言是全世界排名第10位之列好像很多人我们都不知道有什么语言，对吧？它每一个邦好像都有一种特别的语言，所以在统合过程中间，让整个这些人口这些不同的族裔、不同的教育的人能够帮助印度一起来发展，这是一个非常大的一个难点。
这就是接下来我们要谈的问题。刚才我们提到了印度的这个莫迪特别赞许的这个湿婆的神像。刚才何明先生说这是印度的古老的名称，这里必须要纠正一点，它更多的是印度教的一个古老的名称。但是就像刚才何明先生所说的，现在印度本国国内有几百个宗教，有几千个不同的由地域和民族种族形成的隔离的空间，因此这一次莫迪在20国集团峰会上不突出当代印度国家的形象，而是重新回到印度教义中的形象，引起了本国人民的非常大的反对。大家认为这是莫迪领导的印度人民党进行选举的标志。你强调的是印度是印度教的印度，但是现代印度早就不是印度教的印度了，印度已经是一个多民族多宗教的这样的一个结合体的国家。因此莫迪在本国国内的反对党对于这一次可以说是莫迪攫取了整个印度教民族主义的议程，觉得十分的愤怒。特别是昨天在峰会晚宴的邀请函上，直接用古老的梵文婆罗多取代了印度当代国家的说法，引起了本国反对党极大的愤怒和不满。如果说这一次还是某一种礼仪但是过去几年期间，莫迪在本国进行统治的时候，对于本国宗教以及民主的侵蚀，更是引起了很多印度国内政治评论家的极大的反对。印度教多数派还有穆斯林宗教少数派之间产生了极大的矛盾，而外界也普遍认为，莫迪领导的印度教多数派对于本国的穆斯林等其他的宗教犯下了严重的人权侵犯的行为。莫迪在今年早些时候访问美国的时候曾经说我听到有人对于印度民主的承诺感到质疑，我觉得非常的惊讶。但是如果您对于印度本国政治有所了解，应该知道这样争议的声音其实从莫迪上台以来就根本没有停下来。印度有一点和中国很像，就是随着自己本国实力的增强，现在对于来自其他国家的批评似乎并不那么在意了。不管是美国、中国、俄罗斯还是其他的什么国家，用莫迪自己的话说，我们现在已经是有14亿人口的大国了，我们还是世界第5大经济体。当我们表达我们的立场并且自信地说出来，人们就会接受。如果我们不敢表达我们的立场，如果我们犹豫不决，世界就会把我们推到墙角。我们仔细一听， 这与习近平说敢于斗争、善于斗争也差不多啊。那么呢，这个印度这个国家呀，它的民主的退化，其实呢，在美国的很多政策界也有非常强烈的反对声音。我们还记得，印度在几个月前，总理莫迪到美国国会受到了非常高规格的接待。当时，美国的民主党内的一些进步派的官员就选择拒绝出席这一次这个莫迪在国会的演讲，认为不可以找这样一个破坏、侵蚀民主要义的国家领导人，仅为美国一国利益，就给他如此崇高的待遇。那么，来自彭博社的文章也分析到，印度现在最重要的问题，其实还不是在外交上还能够打开多少空间，它在外交上的空间既与自己本身外交政策的长袖善舞有关，但更重要的是，现在美国以及西方国家在与中国的地缘政治斗争中，必须要牢牢拉住印度这个盟友。印度真正的问题，第一是本国国内政治的问题，根深蒂固的宗教历史矛盾；第二就是经济发展的问题。大家看到印度是世界第4大、第5大经济体，甚至未来还有可能取得更加领先的地位，这固然不假。但是印度本国人民在基本的识字率、在卫生条件、在清洁用水、在对待疟疾和一些比较基础类的传染病方面，仍然是一个非常有发展空间的这样的一个国家。因此，在谈到印度发展未来的时候，这一些基础性的问题仍然是亟需解决的难题。说了印度我们再来看看中国。如果说印度是现在形势严峻，未来前途光明的话呢，中国可能最辉煌的时代已经在身后了，至少有很多美国的政策观察者是这么认为的。今天我们要为大家介绍的是来自《纽约时报》的文章。《纽约时报》的文章就讲了这样的一个观点：现在习近平的战略似乎呢是面临很大的压力，因为中国的经济形势发生了变化。习近平是不是有可能会放弃部分控制权呢？这是《纽约时报》这一篇文章给我们提出的一个问题。的确，说到现在中国经济遭遇的问题，我们已经强调了很多次，不管是地方政府的债台高筑，还是现在消费者的情绪低迷，还是西方投资者对于中国的态度变化，还是房地产企业濒临倒闭等等等等，外界普遍认为，目前的时刻可能是习近平执政10几年来面临最持久、最棘手的挑战。这可以说对于中国来说是一个非常具有不确定的时刻，也是非常瞬息万变的时刻。有一种分析认为习近平很有可能迫于这种经济形势和压力，不得不做出一些方向性的调整。但是从种种迹象来看，习近平似乎仍在既定的政治议程上继续推动自己团队的计划。目前，习近平面临一系列艰难的选择：第一，到底是不是给私营企业更多的发展空间、话语权和自由；第二，是不是要给负债累累的地方政府提供更多的财政支持；第三，是不是要继续动用自己的政治权力和政治根基，来推行一些对于经济而言可能造成短期痛苦的这样的一些措施，比如开征房地产新税等等等等。中国经济问题的关键是什么呢？如果问经济学家，10个中有9个人都会告诉你，关键还是房地产的问题。作为之前20几年中国经济增长的主要驱动力和引擎，现在中国开发商的债务水平已经达到了让人生畏的程度。习近平在近些年来在经济领域采取的一系列措施，包括监管打压、对于资本无序扩张的控制，以及对于私营企业家和投资者的新的限制，现在陷入了争议。未来政府提供更多支持，到底是不是已经在议程之上了？政策界也有不同的看法。但是房地产行业的长期低迷也给地方政府的资产负债表带来新的压力。地方政府到底怎样获得新的收入来源，现在仍然也是问题。有分析声音说尽管习近平对于政治权力的稳固似乎是有一种热衷，也喜欢牢牢大权在握的感觉，但是出现了这么多新的情况和新的变化，可能不得不意味着习近平必须放弃一些控制。如何走出这个挑战性的困境，习近平的空间已经不多了。中国共产党似乎一直在向对外表明中国的经济挑战是可控的， 不管是电动汽车还是清洁能源，不断有新的增长动力涌现。也不是所有的经济学家都认为中国的经济在陷入不可逆转的下滑，但是长期问题是的确存在的，经济增长放缓也是现实。而在习近平看来，还有另外一个重要的隐患，就是所谓的国家安全问题，他不得不随时应对，在他看来来自西方的威胁。私营部门的支持者呀，现在往往对于习近平的想法提出不满，认为这样的一种国家主义的政策正在把中国带入死胡同中。之前啊，中国网民间流传着刘梦熊先生所写的一篇文章，其中题目引起了很大的注意和反响，发表在联合早报上，叫问题出在经济，而根子是在政治，直接指向了中国政府在过去的一些年中，在政策上的倒退，导致企业家预期不稳，信心不足，认为这一切直接制约了新兴产业的发展。北京还有一位学者叫做胡星斗，他直接发出了更加大胆的变革呼吁，敦促习近平结束战狼外交，认为这助长了中国和其他国家的紧张关系，又希望习近平能够重新复活市场的活力和重要性，强调市场经济对于整个中国经济发展的主导作用。中国政府现在还没有拿出对于开发商和地方政府的大型救援计划，外界也质疑中国是不是最终会这样做。中国领导层似乎不希望助长中央政府是救世主的观念，不是出了什么问题中央政府都要来做，但是这导致中国自己好像就变成了压力锅。一方面，私营企业必须要为过去的一些政策失误承担责任；另外一方面，在国家安全的高压之下，很多中国人觉得言论表达的自由空间越来越小，活着也越来越郁闷。放手不管的做法很难在中国被真正的继承，但是现在中国政府不得不举债，而地方政府，特别是很多贫困的地方政府，也不得不需要中央政府出面来解决债务中最难处理的一部分，或者是干脆直接承担社会服务的成本。改革财税体系也许是习近平在未来10几年需要解决的问题。财税体系中的很多功能失调，实际是今天中国地方政府债务的根源。恢复政府财政，再加上要恢复私人投资者的信心，这显然是一个十分艰巨的难题。中国的税收到底要恢复到什么样的水平？房地产这样一个极富争议和政治挑战的问题，能不能够顺期推出？这不仅仅是对于习近平本人的考验，其实也是对于习近平政治基础和政治能力的一次真正的试金石。有分析说说中国如果实现财税改革，那几乎是需要以习近平全能的方式来实现。有的时候我们批评习近平过于强大、过于集权，但是在某种程度上只有真正更加集权的习近平才可以实现这样一样挑战非凡的任务。现在大家也普遍关注未来几个月的政治局会议上到底会对经济议程发出什么样的信号。在2015年的时候，习近平在3中全会上曾经公布了一项雄心勃勃的60点计划，其中明确承诺扩大市场在经济中的作用。现在看来事与愿违，方向似乎正好相反。有一些中国前经济学者和官员也警告说，中国改革的时间也不多了。比如一直以直言不讳著称的前财政部长楼继伟，近期在接受财新采访时说现在我们是房地产行业遇到了天花板，消费行业也遇到了天花板，我们在体制上如果被卡住了，不能够解决这个问题，咱们就全面僵化，真的是触碰到天花板了。纽约时报这一篇文章可以说是帮我们总结了中国经济发展的有关的困境。其中引述分析师提出的一个比较有趣的想法，就是说习近平的确是控制了很多的权力，中国经济的很多问题也正是因为控制了太多的权力而来。但是现在的悖论是，要解决中国经济现在陷入的深度困境，可能还需要习近平掌握更大的困境，才能够迈出艰难改革的一步。这个观点，革命先生，你是不是同意？
是的，这篇文章大体上比较平实的梳理了现在很多的商界的朋友， 文化界的朋友、思想界的朋友对中国今天所存在的困境的一个就是现象。这个里面有几点啊，我觉得就是讲得很对的，就是问题非常之多啊。但是呢，如果没有强大的权力，这些问题根本就解决不了啊。如果采取像西方这种民主化的方式，大家就讨论，但是讨论结果是不是真正产生一个优化的结果呢，并不知道。但是至少呢，大家一起来承担这个责任，哪怕是烂的或者是有问题的，大家都是经过讨论的。那中国不是，中国没有这个民主的体制，那么呢，如果要急速进行一个民主的体制，中国就会进入到南美这种国家或者是进入我们苏联东欧的所看到的这些国家的这个现象，因为大部分的数据已经显示了这一点。但是强权的问题就是，当你的权力过分强了之后，你会比较形成社会的刚性化非常刚性。现在习近平在最高层已经没有什么人对他挑战，什么元老挑战呀，或者是什么其他挑战，那都是就是微不足道的，或者根本就不存在的事情。但是真正的挑战是这个中下层的官员，这些人在你的这种政治的那种刚性的要求之下，他要么就跟着你一起执行，要么呢他就觉得呢我就不执行你所谓的躺平，其实可怕的还不是社会的躺平，躺平是决定中国的底层的，甚至可以说执行习近平真正命令的是中下层官员。这些人现在对习近平的很多的做法，从心里面是非常非常反感的是或者说是非常疲惫的，因为他们知道我按照你的指示做了然后我就肯定要承担责任为了找我算账，要么就是贪污要么就是什么样，尤其是现在泛贪是最大的政治正确。那你说过去几十年有几个人不在经济上有一些不确定的因素但是你体制不好你体制的缺陷造成的。现在要这些精英的官员承担责任是不公平的，也是缺乏法治精神的。但是政治就是这么胡来，那么这就造成现在习近平真正的问题，就是中下层采取这种政治机器人的方式来对付你，谁洗碗跟着你去谁口号也跟着你去喊，但是我就不主动做事我不主动做事情，就是今天中国的信心的根源是来自于这些精英人士对习近平现在这种强权做法的一种内心的一种反感。但是这种反感毫无疑问是天真的，毫无疑问是对一个体制的转型的艰难性是缺乏这个了解，缺乏掌握和思考。因为中国改革开放能够取得这么大的一个成就，几乎所有的或者多数中国人或者相当多的中国精英分子吧，他们认为这是学习西方改革开放的一个成果。你现在已经开始要跟西方产生某一种对立产生某一种封闭的政策，那中国的改革开放如果不能持续下去，那中国又变成一个更加一个封锁的国家，那中国是没有前途的。这些人没有意识到，当一个国家的经济发展到一定程度以后，确实面临一个体制的选择，你是尽快的学习西方这一套，引进西方的政治体制，还是说呢，在这个你原来的这问题没有清理之前，要还不宜建立一个新兴的体制有些事情你必须采取非常的手段去解决它。但是这些东西，习近平似乎是没有能够成功的说服中国的精英阶层。所以我所见到的很多的商人，见到了很多的精英阶层的人，他们对习近平是普遍是反感。那这是习近平现在真正的一个难题。因为这批人如果不能得到信心，这批人如果真正是想不通，那习近平在上面高高在上喊很多口号是没有用的，你要求大家去强行学习是没有用的没有用的。实际上今天中国的很多问题当然不是习近平造成的，是改革开放30年，甚至是毛泽东、邓小平他们留下的很多的遗产，也是一个国家转型过程中间所必有的一个调整。比如说你房地产，你说这个打击房地产，对吧？刚性三条红线部分刚性，你说不打击，你说中国房地产就继续20%的比例，再变成30%的比例，变成40%的比例，那才是像拜登总统讲的，那是炸弹。现在采取的方式是爬来把地来给一个一个爬除，但是你这个爬来的人爬得不好， 你就是你的问题了，人家不太会想进谁拿了这个来，所以习近平的接纳的程度很多。不过呢我是媒体可以说都是阅读西方阅读这个各路的这个智库他们的研究报告，几乎相对来讲比较平衡点。一般性的国际媒体基本上都是讲这种人人议论的话，可以说基本上没有什么穿透力中国能不能真正走出难关，我们也不知道但是现在存在的问题不是长期的，即使是短期的，恰恰相反了。他们认为是中国的现在存在的问题将会长期存在。我今天早上听我们的简报里面还讲到多少年以后中国的 GDP 是2%、1%，我也真的到了那个时候它就不是问题了。西方文明发展到一定程度以后，它就是一个低的增长。问题是中国不是4%、3%的问题。像这篇文章里面讲的财税体制你不建立起来，是造成今天的财政问题的一个根由昨天李杰博士也引述《经济时报》的一位经济学家的观点，那中国只能自己割自己的韭菜只能自己来惩治自己不像美国美国可以把全世界变成他的韭菜没有这个杠杆对吧？中国只有自己来承受这个孤独的危机。我认为很大的比例有可能会度过这个难关但是这个就是还是要取决于习近平能不能真正说服他的这个官僚团队或者是这个政治基线团队。他要求大家强行的学习这个习近平的这个各种剧组可能也就是出于这样一个想法。因为习近平的剧组大部分都是一些政策性的指引，他并不是说像穆迪这样神乎其神讲一点哲学这个习近平也没什么哲学思想，不像老毛对吧？他更多的是一种政策上的思考。那我们不太清楚，我们看得从表面来讲是厌恶这种政治学习，那对于官员来讲是不是真的在学习过程中间理解到一个体制的转型的习近平的想法，他们这种认不认同，我觉得这是一个真正决定性的东西。这些东西我们现在还不能完全站在我个人的心理来讲，我是非常反感的，但是站在政治实际的来讲，未必是那么简单。
好，谢谢何明先生的点评那么呢，在过去的几天里实际上在思想先驱报中，我们是引述国际媒体为大家介绍了一系列有关于中国经济状况的分析不知道哪一些情况与您所观察到的更加的类似，哪一些情况似乎与您所看到的情况并不相符。我们也欢迎您能够在节目的留言区告诉我们您的看法，看一看我们所提供的这一些思路是不是与您对于中国社会经济实际的观察相吻合。感谢麦团打赏，感谢如是我们打赏，谢谢这些观众朋友们对于我们的支持。明天同一时间思想先驱报与您再会。
I wanted to start with, I guess, the broad view from Washington, and that is, given your experience at the White House, how you think about the slowdown we're seeing in China and how it will impact U.S. policy towards China and this competition that's really dominated our thinking for some time.
Sure, and thanks so much for having me on this morning. I'm excited to be making my debut on Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it these days with this Twitter Spaces. I think there's two dimensions to talking about U.S. policy towards China when it comes to China's economic challenges. And I'm going to turn to Gerard in a second to talk about the second dimension, which is what it means for economic policy. But I think when it comes to the U.S.'s broader strategy towards Beijing, really, the fundamentals here, I think, are not going to change in Washington's view. The U.S. policymakers are basing their assessments on the challenge that China presents in a number of dimensions. The economy is really only one element of it. China is going to continue to be a major power, a major military power, a major player on the international stage, even if its economy slows down. The reference point a lot of people will make is to the Cold War. And if you look at the Soviet Union continued to be a major rival to the United States well after its economy had stagnated. And I think that's how many people in the strategic space are thinking about China, that it will continue to present major challenges even if its economy slows down. I think the other dimension that comes up in the strategic space is the question of, is China's economic woes going to make Beijing more likely or maybe more more eager to kind of pick international fights, maybe to distract its populace from troubles at home. And I just don't really see that happening. Sort of diversionary war theory hasn't really been seen in China. And I think what we are more likely to see is Beijing kind of hunkering down, focusing on domestic issues. They don't tend to like to have to face multiple crises at once. I think on the flip side of that, what we might see is greater sensitivity, what we might call like aggressive defensiveness when they do feel their interests are challenged, to respond more assertively to that. But I don't think we're going to be seeing Beijing necessarily picking fights to distract people from its troubles at home.
It does feel, though, like this summer has seen like a kind of shift in the narrative on China here in Washington and elsewhere. We had in our piece today, we quote Richard Fontaine, who's the CEO of the Center for New American Security here in Washington, talking about how the conventional wisdom seems to be flipping from a concern with the unstoppable rise of Chinese power to this worry about a irrevocable decline of China's economy, and also pointing to its demographics and population. Do you feel like there's been a kind of a shift over the summer?
I think that's definitely true. I will say, in my experience, that this isn't the first time. I think there are moments when anytime there's a stumble in China, inevitably some people are going to jump on that and say, "Oh, this means that it's over for China and China's miracle." I will say, I think, kind of broadly speaking, a huge driver of China's international influence, and particularly with developing countries, has been this notion of its inevitable rise and its economic miracle. And I think if it looks like they are no longer experiencing that miracle, that might take some of the international shine off China. But I wouldn't overhype that. I think for a lot of countries, China is still going to be a major market, a major player, a major economy, and the change might be marginal. I do think sort of the flip side of that is, there is a narrative longstanding in Beijing of China's inevitable rise and the U.S.'s inevitable descent. And I think maybe that argument is a little bit harder to make now that the U.S. economy seems to be doing a little bit better than China's. But again, I don't know that I necessarily see them changing their strategy based on that fact. The only other thing I'd mention is kind of we've been talking about sort of the strategic conversation in Washington. There's obviously also a political conversation. And based on everything I'm seeing, I think China still continues to have a lot of political currency, even though its economy might be experiencing some challenges right now. So I think there will still continue to be a little bit of heat behind U.S. attention towards China. Again, I think people are still going to see it in the policymaking space as the most important challenge that the United States is facing.
Yeah, I think we're certainly going to see a lot more noise and heat in the U.S. as we go into next year's presidential election campaign, and China, as you say, is seen as one of the major challenges. Gerard, I want to bring you in here. What is going on with the Chinese economy right now? We had some measures announced overnight from the central bank and also authorities in Shanghai and Beijing to lower mortgage rates. I'd love to hear your take on what we're seeing in terms of the slowdown and where you think it's going to go.
I think the simplest answer is, particularly for asking from the perspective of what has actually changed over the last year or two, it's that the property sector is finally deflating, in large part, initially at least, because Beijing tried to make that happen because they thought it was too speculative. So as Jennifer mentioned, there have been slowdowns before. The dramatic one was 2015 when they had a lot of capital outflows, but that wasn't really seen as like a permanent structural thing. I think the difference this time is the narrative is that, oh, this might be lasting. The demographic situation has clearly gotten worse, but I should point out, I think actually what the real delta here is not necessarily the pace of reforms or demographics. It's really the property sector, and then the end of the export boom they got from COVID, Where is it going? I think the view in Bloomberg Economics is that essentially what used to be the low end case is now the baseline. So we could see something like 2 or 3% growth by the end of this decade. It had been put at 4% before that. For me, the big question is basically what's going to happen to the property sector. It's not obvious to me what can replace real estate in terms of an investment and an actual consumption driver, because it was basically a third of investment, and investment is a very large share of the economy. And the other alternatives would have to be infrastructure, which means more government debt for localities, which is in some cases already tapped out. And you could have more manufacturing investment, but a lot of that is based on internal demand or exports, which are slowing. So I think it's the narrative is maybe a little bit overhyped in the sense that people that were watching this closely would have said it's not dramatically different now than it was, say, 6 months or 9 or a year ago. I think just the narrative twist happened because a lot of people, including in markets, have been expecting the consumption rebound after they reopened from COVID to be more robust than it was. And it has happened, but it hasn't been enough to get back on their previous trajectory. So that intersecting with the exports and intersecting with the property sector is why it looks like it does. The recent indicators are, basically that maybe they're bottoming out in terms of manufacturing. There was data that came in overnight on smaller manufacturers that actually showed an expansion. On the other hand, the service sector data looked worse than expected. So it's not a collapse, but it's affecting the long-term trajectory, which I think is really why the perceptions have shifted.
Just before we go any further, I want to mention to our audience that you can send a direct message to our @business account if you have any questions, and we'll address them here on the air. Gerard, I mean, the other question for me is whether Xi Jinping and the rest of the Chinese leadership have a handle on this, right? And one of the things we heard as we were talking to folks here in Washington and in other capitals was this assumption that the Chinese leadership has been able to respond in the past, kind of confidence that they will be able to avoid a hard landing in the Chinese economy, and also, pointing out that China has a lot of financial resources that it can deploy to stimulate the economy if it needs to. Are you as confident that the Chinese leadership has a handle on this as some of the folks in officialdom?
I think the general narrative that the Chinese government is very good at economic planning is overhyped. That's less controversial to say now than it was 5 years ago. They're clearly monitoring the situation, given a bunch of measures released, particularly with mortgages and property sector over the past few days. I think they probably started the crackdown, the 3 red lines policy, as it was called, on the property sector without a clear plan as to where that was going and how to mitigate some of the effects. I think, frankly, they're probably mostly flying by the seat of their pants at this point. Can they manage it? Yes, probably, but probably in a way that is not optimal. And I think I have not really seen in the discourse of a plan for where the economy goes after real estate. And that to me remains the main question. So another point is that the Chinese fiscal policy has been quite conservative this year. Actually, if you look at just on budget spending, it's contracted year over year. Part of that is because they're trying to constrain debt levels in localities. But also, if you compare the discourse in China in recent years compared to the United States, where we both faced the same shock, which was COVID, U.S. fiscal policy was much more creative and much more expansive. The Chinese policymakers seem to keep reaching for the same tools, things like tax cuts, more infrastructure, rebates to try to get people to do consumption. What they have not done is provide direct support to households. So it's really not all that innovative. And I think there's a sense that they're kind of the old toolbox is getting stale, to muddle analogies.
Alessandra, I want to bring you in here and get the view from Rome and Europe. I guess the end of summer view from Europe. What are people making of this in European capitals? I mean, the sense in Washington for a long time has been that Europe is more reluctant, or has been more reluctant, to disengage with China, and sees China as less of a threat and perhaps more of a commercial partner than here in the U.S. But that seems to be changing.
There is this idea in Europe in general that they would wanted to follow the US's lead on China, but not quite as strong on certain issues. They were concerned about the relationship with China. Of course, when you talk about Europe, we're talking about lots of different countries. Each one has its own policy. There is also a EU Brussels view. We spoke to people in Berlin, in Rome, in Paris, and in Brussels. And the view seems to be that, particularly because China is slowing and it seems to be structural. I mean, one of our sources was saying, well, maybe it's a little bit like Europe after the big boom, after the big economic boom, you can't get that same kind of growth. And so it's something that going forward, they're not going to go quite the same way. But the capitals are concerned that, China shouldn't be left alone, shouldn't feel too threatened. So they're backing away slowly, one could say, from certain investments. But overall, they don't want China to feel ill at ease. And also consider, the EU's trade deficit with China is over $1 billion a day. So that's not going anywhere. What is happening is a lot of companies are sort of disinvesting. They're looking to India, they're looking to Southeast Asia. So the relative weight, of China is likely to decrease. But definitely this idea that Europe wants to help China, there are opportunities there for some companies, but they'll follow the American lead to a point.
And this gets at, and I was listening to the German ambassador, or the new German ambassador to Washington earlier this week, talk about this. But it gets to a little bit also what you were talking about, Jennifer, earlier on, which is, a slower China is just a less attractive China for investors, right? For foreign investors. And we had this, pretty also this week, pretty stunning statement from Gina Raimondo, the U.S. Commerce Secretary, as she was racing on a high-speed train from Beijing to Shanghai, talk about how she increasingly was hearing from U.S. companies that they saw China as uninvestable. And that's been, this relates to this inevitable rise narrative that had been there for so long. For so long, if you were a big multinational company, the future was China, right? And that is changing. Jennifer, Gerard, do you want to jump in?
Well, I worry that we're kind of overstating the transition here. So even if the Chinese economy is slowing down for structural reasons, which it probably is, China is still the world's leading manufacturer by far, right? So, and they're still advancing in various technologies. I wrote a piece on the terminal about how the slowdown will affect industrial policy in China, which is a major policy focus, obviously. And the bottom line is that it will probably maybe modestly constrain some of the expenditures, at least for localities. But the bigger effect is that it will make China a less appealing market, as you mentioned, and might make it basically reduce market entry, make it less competitive. That ends up reducing some of the effectiveness of industrial policy, because we know that in China's case, like with electric vehicles, like with solar panels, it works best when you have a lot of competition. And I think a slower growing economy where companies expect slower growth is one where those policies become less effective. But it's still going to be an economic powerhouse under any scenario.
Victoria, I want to bring you in here because you've been engaged in a conversation with folks at the U.S. Treasury for months now about China and growth. And I think of an interview you did in June with Janet Yellen, where she was starting to point to longer term challenges in China and possibly even saying that she was detecting a kind of changed attitude in conversations with the Chinese.
Yeah, hi, Sean. Thank you for having me. You're right. We talked about this in June. I think that was shortly after there was the Zambia deal on debt, which we were waiting for a long time, and we're just having this conversation. And I was like, is there a sense that China is becoming more constructive in certain international issues, and what could be driving that? And I think the Secretary mentioned at the time that it could be that they have these like long-term economic problems that we've discussed on this Twitter space, that there are the structural issues in their economy, the demographics, the youth unemployment. So it could be that they are they just want to, put out a message to foreign investors that they are, cooperative, they are constructive, and they are, open for business, and they can sit at the table and talk. So I think that was like one of the first times we started thinking about it, at least internally, as an issue.
And I mean the kind of mood in the relationship, right? That's been such a theme this year. I mean, it feels like a long time ago, but the Chinese spy balloons flying over America and the reaction that we had then, the kind of the real attempts that we've seen from the Biden administration to re-engage in recent months. Gina Raimondo's trip this week was seen as pretty important. Jennifer, do you want to just talk a little bit about Raimondo's trip and also about the Chinese reaction?
Sure thing. So I think as folks are tracking, Raimondo was the fourth senior U.S. official to go to China in recent months, following Secretary of State Tony Blinken, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, and Climate Envoy John Kerry. Raimondo's trip, I think she was going with sort of a similar mission, a similar tone of, seeking to persuade China that we're not trying to contain China, that the export control measures that her department in particular manages are aimed at sort of a narrow band of technologies that the U.S. sees as having national security implications, not aimed at kind of constraining China's broader economic growth. And I think what was interesting from her trip in comparison to the prior officials was the kind of tone surrounding it, the atmosphere around it seemed far more positive, again, despite the fact that, she arguably represents the department that's dealt the most damage to China's economy in terms of those export controls. And yet the tone of her meeting seemed very positive. Even her comments about China's investment environment did not seem to spark as strong of a reaction. And we started to see kind of a mirroring of tones in Beijing in terms of what their expectations are now for these meetings. In advance of Raimondo's departure, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, was trying to kind of downplay expectations for the trip and saying, this isn't about producing major deliverables. This is about just keeping communication channels open. And I recall seeing a couple of commentaries in Beijing while Raimondo was there echoing that same thing, that, this isn't about major deliverables. This is about keeping the channels of communication open. And even the outcomes from her trip, for example, the export control information exchange mechanism, it's clear from how Raimondo was describing it, that's not about changing U.S. policy. She seemed to be quite emphatic that the U.S. is not considering changing its policy on export controls. It's more about sharing more information with Beijing so that they understand the scope of them. So I think from my perspective, this is an indication that U.S. policy towards China, this competitive stance, is maturing. It's not really shifting. This is kind of an outgrowth of what the Biden administration has been trying to do for some time, which is, maintain stability in the relationship while continuing competitive actions. And Beijing, for the first few years, was very reluctant to even accept a sort of competitive frame for the relationship. And fought against that for some time. And what I saw this week with Raimondo being in Beijing seemed to be a little bit more perhaps begrudging acceptance of, this is the reality now of U.S. policy. It's not going to shift.
And I mean, do you think that kind of grudging acceptance is related at all to the fact that you have a weaker economy, that China's economy or China's position just may not be as strong?
Yeah, I think it's probably not entirely coincidental. And, even creating some sort of positive vibes from having your commerce secretary who, yes, her department controls the export controls, but they obviously control the commercial relationship as well. That, can't hurt to try and create some sort of positive atmosphere or sense that things might be moving in the right direction. And some of the other deliverables from her trip, another iteration of the tourism summit, starting of this sort of commercial working group, I think are aimed at doing that, creating some sense that there might be areas for improvement, even if marginal, in terms of the commercial relationship.
I mean, it's for years now, and it goes back to the Trump administration. One of the things I kept hearing from former officials was a kind of a real feeling that this dialogue, just a conversation between the U.S. and China, had really dried up, and that you had even lower level conversations that just weren't happening the same way that they used to in the past. But we seem to be kind of returning to normal a little bit. And, you know, in the normal world, and I want to come back to you here, Victoria, you know, we would have a kind of fall full of symmetry. We've got the G20, although we learned yesterday that Xi Jinping is probably not attending that. We've got APEC coming up. We've got the ASEAN summit. Traditionally, this is where leaders have their bilaterals on the side, and the kind of relationship grows. What are we going to see in the coming weeks, Victoria?
Yeah, Sean, you're exactly right. I mean, I think over the past years, conversation at pretty much all levels had kind of stopped, and especially at places like the Treasury, it used to be in the past that they had very frequent talks with their counterparts, and that was a big issue because obviously, you know, there was a lack of information about what was going on in the Chinese economy. But you know, since the trips by Blinken, by Yellen, by Raimondo more recently, I think there is a big concerted effort to reinstate channels of communication leading up potentially to, you know, a meeting between Biden and Xi. And like you said, we don't expect Xi to go to India next week, or at least that's the latest we're hearing. But the APEC summit in San Francisco in November is kind of the next opportunity that people are looking at to see whether we will have a meeting at the leaders level and, you know, kind of have a more formal, you know, effort to thaw the relationship.
Yeah, that's going to be pretty remarkable if Xi Jinping comes to San Francisco on the eve of a U.S. election year. It's going to be some interesting geoeconomic theater around that. Alessandra, I just want to come back to you quickly as well here and say, what's the kind of European travel agenda for the coming months? I know, you know, Europe, like the U.S., doesn't want to give up on the commercial relationship, even if China is slowing down. And we've certainly seen some EU member states and some British ministers head over to China with the usual sales pitch as well.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I don't think they can give up on the relationship. There's no option there, as you were kind of saying. There are going to be other opportunities, and I think there are several issues in Europe because, for example, I'm in Rome right now, and Italy is a partner in the Belt and Road. It's the only G7 nation which is in that, and they've sort of been encouraged by the U.S. to get out of that, back away, but they're doing it slowly. And so that's sort of the tone. In many ways, they're actually not backing away from Belt and Road, but they're emptying it out. For example, there are now more increasingly in Europe, we see, you know, export control measures of different kinds. Italy just passed one. And so that's kind of the softer attitude they're taking. It's very important, I think, to the Europeans to make sure that China doesn't feel like it's losing face. And I think that's what they're doing right now. On the other hand, you know, one of the ministers told us off record, we can't expect China to change too much. If there's something we don't like, we're the ones who have to change and adapt. So I think that's something we've also been hearing on the European end.
All right, I think we're going to gently wrap this up. Before we do that, I want to do a kind of a final lightning round and put my colleagues on the spot here. I think, Gerard, we're going to start with you, and then we'll go back to Victoria, Alessandra, and end with Jennifer. I'm going to ask you a simple question, ask you for a punchy answer, and that is, when we gather back here a year from now on the eve of the Labor Day weekend and the traditional end of summer here in the United States, which economy is going to be in better shape, the Chinese economy or the U.S. economy? And maybe we should bring in the European economy as well. And yes, I know I'm putting you on the spot, but that's why I'm here.
I think cyclically it might look like the Chinese economy has recovered, whereas the U.S. economy possibly could be in a brief recession. I think in the longer term, one thing just to emphasize with China is how government policy interacts with this problem, how they try to address it, whether it changes sentiment, particularly sort of in the technology and investment community, because a lot of this is basically within the hands of Beijing of how can they actually mitigate these issues and address the concerns that a lot of investors, including Chinese investors, have.
Victoria, I'm going to go to you. I'm sure they're incredibly confident at the U.S. Treasury that everything's going to be fine in the U.S. economy, but what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think the sense for now is that, Beijing does have the tools to deal with like a large part of the issue the crisis it's facing, the slowdown it's facing, I guess. So I think whether they do that and the extent to which they do that and how they do that will determine the answer to your question. So I don't know that part. But I think at least for now, the sense is that, while this is obviously like a headwind for the global economy and it is a risk factor, it doesn't dent the optimism or the outlook for the U.S. economy, at least of the administration. So I think we have to wait and see what happens in Beijing.
Alessandra, over in Europe, one of the interesting things that we heard in reporting this piece was some governments kind of quietly welcoming the Chinese slowdown and saying that it would help their fight against inflation, which has been pretty stubborn there.
It has indeed. So I guess my answer is, we have to see what the European Central Bank does in the next couple of months, and whether that how that impacts the economy. The view from here, if I have to pick one of the three, it's still that the U.S. will ultimately, not do that badly. And China, in some ways, there was some Schadenfreude, as the Germans say, happiness that they're having some issues.
You said earlier it's not all about the economy, but boy, the economy is the kind of core of the relationship and has been for a long time, right?
No, I think that's right. It was often considered sort of the ballast of the relationship, particularly when China, was no longer kind of the Cold War ally that it had been. So I think going forward, it'll be interesting to see, again, coming off of Armando's trip, whether or not there is that sort of ballast, whether or not the business communities are really vouching for, kind of stabler ties in going forward. But as Gerard noted, China is going to continue to be a major market, a major economy. So to a certain extent, we shouldn't overhype the implications of that there. And in terms of where we'll be a year from now, I totally agree with everything he said in terms of like what the fundamentals will be going forward.
大家好，我是华尔街电视的小安，为大家主持一档新的节目《亚洲大眼睛》。什么样的内容，您慢慢看就知道了。一艘沉船，一段酝酿了数十年的冲突，两国之间的矛盾越陷越深。专家们都认为，中非关系紧张，战争随时可能爆发。根据法兰克福评论报报道，北京在南中国海正与菲律宾展开对抗。中国与菲律宾冲突的中心是一艘沉船。菲律宾于1999年把海军运输舰马德雷山麦号搁浅于仁爱礁，以宣示主权，并在状况日趋恶劣的残骸上派驻海军士兵。该残骸可能会加剧中国和菲律宾之间的冲突，而这一场冲突已经酝酿了数十年，但世界上其他国家基本上没有注意到这一冲突。菲律宾最亲密的盟友之一，美国则越来越多的参与其中。RFI 报道，中国问题专家卡内基国际事务伦理委员会高级研究员亚历山大·格尔拉赫认为，这一场危机足以演变成一场武装冲突，与菲律宾的战争随时可能爆发，因为中国国家主席习近平正在追求将该地区置于中国控制之下的既定目标。北京有时对菲律宾海岸警卫队使用武力，并且越来越考验美国的耐心。那南沙群岛位于南中国海，北京几乎完全将其视为自己领土的一部分，但台湾、马来西亚、越南、汶莱和菲律宾也宣示自己对全部或部分海域拥有主权。2016年，海洋国际仲裁法庭驳回了中国的主张，但北京至今无视这一判决。根据近4000年前夏朝的历史记录，中国声称对包括仁爱礁在内的几乎整个南海拥有主权。那北京用一条 U 型9段线来表明其对关键海域一条重要的海上运输路线的主权主张。该线切入汶莱、印度尼西亚、马来西亚、菲律宾的专属经济区域、专属经济区、台湾地区和越南。 那中国在南海的影响力始于几十年前，北京于1974年从越南手中收回了西沙群岛，并于1995年从菲律宾手中收回了南沙群岛和美济礁。但海牙法庭根据菲律宾提出的诉讼，于2016年裁定，中国对南海水域没有历史性所有权，其九段线和历史性主张已被1982年联合国海洋公约取代。然而北京却对这一裁决提出异议。其实争议的焦点不是这些岛屿本身，这些岛屿没有人居住，而且大多不适宜居住，但该地区有丰富的渔场，这里还发现了大量的石油和天然气。最重要的是，谁控制了南海，谁就控制了世界上最重要的贸易路线之一。全球1/3的集装箱通过这条全球经济的大动脉来运输。但北京还认为自己受到美国在该地区不断膨胀的威胁。自大约1年前，美国已经获准使用菲律宾的9个军事基地，而此前只有5个。两国还越来越多的举行联合军演。那两国冲突8月再升级。中国和菲律宾之间的紧张局势再次加剧。马尼拉就指责中国海岸警卫队使用高压水枪阻止一艘菲律宾军用补给船向驻扎在南海礁石上的退役军舰上的部队运送食物、燃料和饮用水。8月在有争议的仁爱礁附近发生的对峙，是这片资源丰富海域长期领土冲突的最新升级，涉及中国、菲律宾、越南、马来西亚、台湾和汶莱。那菲律宾称中国海警的行为过度和危险，并召见北京驻马尼拉特使提出正式抗议。而另一方面，北京声称对这片水下珊瑚礁拥有主权。该珊瑚礁在菲律宾被称为阿云金暗沙，在中国被称为仁爱礁。中国督促菲律宾军方将搁浅的船只从该地区移走，但马尼拉却表现出挑衅态度。菲律宾国家安全委员会发言人就表示，菲律宾永远不会放弃我们在阿云金暗沙的立场。北京对此也做出了强烈警告。国防部就表示，中方将继续采取必要措施维护主权。那菲律宾还采取了哪些行动？在紧张局势中，菲律宾总统小费迪南德·马克思表示，菲律宾军队的主要使命数十年来一直与共产党和与基地组织有联系的组织作战，已转变为保卫国家边境。那小马克思与前任总统杜特尔特的政策决裂，寻求加强与美国的防务关系。2023年2月，小马克思政府根据2014年增强防务合作协议 EDCA， 允许美国使用另外4个军事基地。该协议允许美国和菲律宾之间进行联合训练、预先部署设备以及建设跑道等设施、燃料储存和军用住房。这些地点包括了面向中国南海以及台湾岛的地点。美国方面已经宣布向菲律宾提供了1亿美元的军事援助，并提供8200万美元用于升级 EDCA 地点。同年的4月，两军举行了有史以来最大规模的联合演习，那首次包括海上实弹演习。今年5月，小马克思与美国总统拜登举行峰会后，五角大楼明确承诺，如果菲律宾在南海受到攻击，将保卫菲律宾。分析人士就表示，此举旨在向中国发出警告。北京批评马尼拉加强与美国关系的决定，可能将菲律宾拖入地缘政治冲突的深渊。而另一方面，中国和美国还在南海和台湾海峡发生冲突。那6月，五角大楼指责一艘中国海军舰艇在一艘穿越台湾海峡的美国驱逐舰附近进行不安全的演习。5月，又指控一架中国战斗机在南海上空飞行时，对其一架飞机做出了不必要的侵略性行动。中国指责美国对安全问题进行挑衅。那专家就说，不排除中菲紧张关系会升级为冲突。菲律宾拉萨尔大学教授德卡斯特罗就称，如果中美在南中国海发生直接对抗，不排除中菲之间日益紧张的局势可能会升级为冲突，并呼吁中国保持克制的同时称，这个课题将迫使菲律宾向与该国已有数十年安全联盟关系的美国靠拢，因为菲律宾没有能力挑战中国。那他在第36届亚太圆桌会议期间表示，菲律宾不想把美国卷入其中，但在某种程度上，中国在南中国海的课题上表现得如此不妥协，正在推动菲律宾更接近美菲联盟。那与此同时，美国国防部长奥斯汀早前也承诺，如果菲律宾船只在南中国海遭到袭击，美军将保卫菲律宾船只。 那根据1951年的美菲共同防御条约规定，一方在太平洋地区遭遇武装攻击，将被视为对另一方自身和平与安全构成威胁，并将引领另一方采取行动。那小马克思出席东盟峰会，小马克思出席东盟峰会时就表示，菲律宾坚决反对将南海争端简单概括为两大强权竞逐的误导性说法，并指南海和平的远景至今仍是遥远的现实。他表示，这不仅否定了菲律宾的独立性和主导权，也无视了菲律宾在南海拥有的合法利益。小马克思就说，我们面临的挑战仍然是绝不允许国际和平秩序受制于强势权力，以实现霸权野心。和平的未来取决于现今我们如何共同应对此和平的挑战。那小马克思就指出，随着强权间的紧张局势和互不信任升级，误判的前景可能席卷此地区，为我们所有人带来最严重的后果。我们急需运用东协区域架构，作为承诺相互理解、战略互信和和平解决争端的外交桥梁。小马克思就表示，菲律宾不寻求冲突，但身为国民和国家领袖，菲律宾有责任始终挺身而出，因应在南海的主权权利和海洋管辖权的任何挑战。新闻网站 Rappler 就报道，菲律宾驻美国大使罗穆德斯在印尼告诉非国媒体，应美日两国之邀，小马克思将与美国副总统贺锦丽及日本首相岸田文雄会谈。他表示，美日非三方会谈极有可能讨论南海争议和经济合作议题。而中国问题专家卡内基国际事务伦理委员会高级研究员亚历山大·格尔拉赫表示，很难想象一旦发生袭击，华盛顿不会向其盟友提供帮助，但目前还不清楚华盛顿的红线在哪里。那格尔拉赫就认为，冲突不那么容易解决，很简单，中国就是想要西太平洋，但让台湾自愿加入中国，让菲律宾放弃其在南中国海的主张，也是完全不现实的。而习近平并不是地球上唯一一个可能根据自己的全能假设做出错误决定的独裁者。
欢迎您收看华尔街电视简报。中国并不相信美国官员所传达的信息。彭博社，中国国家主席习近平决定不参加本周末在印度举行的20国集团峰会，这可能被视为对印度的冷落，但也可能是对美国的一种信息传递。中国国家安全部发表声明，批评美国试图恢复与中国的对话，称其不真诚。尽管美国试图传达在对中国采取对抗和接触之间寻求中间道路的立场，但言辞上的转变未能平息中国的不满。习主席可能对拜登的行动感到失望，其中包括加大与中国竞争和遏制的努力。中国禁止政府官员使用 iPhone。华尔街日报，悉尼先驱晨报。据华尔街日报报道，中国中央政府机构的官员被要求不得在工作中使用苹果 iPhone 或其他外国品牌的设备，也不能将它们带入办公室。这项禁令发布在一个重要的苹果活动之前，可能引起在中国运营的外国公司的担忧。目前尚不清楚这些命令已经广泛传达到哪里。近年来，中国一直试图减少对外国技术的依赖，推动国内半导体芯片制造，并要求国有企业转向使用本土软件。Cathy Wood 的 ARK Invest 公司申请首个美国现货以太坊交易所交易基金 ETF。路透社， Cathy Wood 的 ARK Invest 和21Shares 已向美国证券交易委员会 SEC 申请设立一支直接持有以太币的交易所交易基金 ETF。这是在美国首次尝试上市一支直接投资以太币的基金。此举是在最近一项具有里程碑意义的裁决之后进行的。该裁决认为 SEC 拒绝一项比特币 ETF 的申请是错误的。这一裁决受到了加密货币和资产管理行业的密切关注。SEC 近年来已经拒绝了多个现货比特币 ETF 的申请，理由是担心欺诈和操纵。美国证券交易委员会批准了关于市场数据监控系统的新费用规定。路透社，美国证券交易委员会 SEC 已经批准了关于资金的新规定，用于建立一个综合市场数据监控系统及综合审计跟踪系统 CAT。 新的资金模式将成本平均分摊给交易所、买方和卖方。投资行业对这些新规定提出了异议，声称他们不公平地分配了成本，并可能转嫁给投资者。CAG 是为了应对2010年的闪崩而创建的，旨在让监管机构 监督美国市场运作。金融危机促使里贾纳民俗音乐节裁员。加拿大 CBC， 加拿大里贾纳民谣音乐节因财务问题而裁员。7月份，该音乐节裁掉了4名员工和1名合同员工，艺术总监和执行总监仍留任。音乐节目前正专注于筹款，并与合作伙伴和资助者联系，以解决财务需求。音乐节上个月举办了一次成功的活动，但仍面临财务危机。音乐节在6月份曾发布了一条紧急信息，请求捐款支持其非营利组织。领导团队和董事会正在努力确保音乐节的生存。今年的冬季活动已被取消，里贾纳市为音乐节提供了一笔拨款，并表示支持该组织。澳大利亚贷款机构 NAB 将裁员200多名后勤人员 AFR。路透社，据报道，澳大利亚国民银行 NAB 计划裁员222人，涉及个人贷款、技术、企业融资和客户覆盖等各个部门。金融部门工会 FSU 已呼吁紧急会议讨论裁员问题。据称 NAB 正在对其7个业务进行广泛的重组。澳大利亚其他主要银行，如澳大利亚联邦银行和西太平洋银行也在裁员以降低成本。随着华尔街的下跌， ASX 将面临更多损失。悉尼先驱晨报，周四，美国股市下跌，标普500指数下跌 0.8%， 道琼斯指数下跌 0.6%， 延续了本周市场的疲软走势。大型科技股是市场的主要拖累因素，苹果下跌 3.9%， 英伟达下跌 3.3%。医疗保健股也出现了亏损，强生下跌 1.2%， 辉瑞下跌 3%。市场的疲软表现是在美国供应管理学会的一项调查显示，美国8月份服务业增长速度超过经济学家的预期之后出现的。汇丰银行加强研究团队，作为其美国股票覆盖范围扩大的一部分备忘录。路透社，汇丰银行正在扩大其美国股票研究范围，将在其全球研究团队中增加6名成员。该银行计划到2023年底将其覆盖范围内的美国股票数量从已有的46只增加约150只。此次扩张正值许多金融公司在各个部门裁员，并从竞争对手中聘请顶级人才的时候。今年6月，汇丰宣布将离开其位于伦敦东部金丝雀码头的长期总部，迁至市中心的一个较小办公室。政治简报，在保守党大会前夕，辛格加强对波利夫雷的批评。加拿大环球邮报，加拿大新民主党领袖贾格米特·辛格在一次政策会议前的演讲中批评了保守党领袖皮埃尔·波利夫雷。辛格指责波利夫雷住在政府资助的豪宅，并享受政府资助的牙科护理，同时反对为低收入加拿大人提供低收入牙科护理。辛格还批评波利夫雷过于关注权力而不是帮助人民。虽然辛格也抨击了总理贾斯汀·特鲁多，但一些人认为，如果他们认为保守党将赢得下一次选举，进步选民将投票支持自由党以阻止波利夫雷。一个美丽的皇后，一个失败的酒店和戈登·盖科的幽灵。悉尼先驱晨报，最近被加冕为澳大利亚环球小姐的莫拉亚·威尔逊是2位欠债1亿澳元的破产房地产开发商的女儿。威尔逊本人是10家被澳大利亚金融监管机构调查的公司的唯一董事和股东。威尔逊声称对他在墨尔本一家拟议中的酒店开发项目中的角色毫不知情，他的代表坚称他与这些公司无关。澳大利亚证券与投资委员会正在对这10家公司采取注销行动，这些公司还欠澳大利亚税务局债务。分析，巴西经济表现出色，但税收下滑打乱了改革计划。路透社，巴西今年的经济增长超出了预期，但税收收入下降，引发了对政府财政目标和税制改革计划的质疑。强劲的增长和疲软的税收之间的差距，是因为巴西的大宗商品出口商的税负较低，推动了国内生产总值的增长，但对政府税收的贡献较少。财政部正在加紧推出紧急措施来增加税收收入，但这种策略可能会削弱该国税制改革的整体推动力。Tornado Cash 的联合创始人对洗钱超过10亿美元的指控表示不认罪。路透社 Roman Storm， 加密货币平台 Tornado Cash 的联合创始人 对涉嫌协助洗钱超过10亿美元的联邦指控表示不认罪。作为美国公民 ，Storm 被指控协助与朝鲜政府有关的网络犯罪组织 Lazarus Group 洗钱数亿美元的黑客所得。Tornado Cash 是一种虚拟货币混币器，允许用户合并加密货币，以隐藏他们的身份和非法所得。另一位联合创始人 Roman Seminon 也被起诉，但目前仍在逃。美国经济活动适度，就业增长疲软，美联储调查。路透社一份美联储报告显示，近几周美国经济增长适度，就业增长温和，而且大部分地区的通胀放缓。该报告发布前，美联储将于9月19日至20日举行下一次利率决策会议，预计政策制定者将保持短期借贷成本的目标稳定。然而，他们可能会在年底前保留加息的可能性。报告还指出，企业预计近期工资增长将放缓，大多数地区报告称整体价格增长已经放缓。谢谢您的收看。上面播报的内容是六度团队推荐的全球专业媒体、智库、政府机构和行业专家的最新报道、分析简报。更详细的内容，请大家去这些媒体、智库的网站阅读。这些内容并不一定反映六度简报的立场，亦不能作为任何决策的建议。六度团队由专业媒体人、学者、科学家组成的独立新型媒体，大家可以根据自己的专业要求订阅各种简报。网址是6dobrief.com。您在世界任何地方都可以通过电邮收到六度简报。